Chapter 1. The Affair at Devora. It is established beyond doubt that Mr. Butler was drunk at the time. This rests upon the evidence of Sergeant Flanagan and the troopers who accompanied him, and it rests upon Mr. Butler's own word, as we shall see. And let me add here and now that however wild and irresponsible a rascal he may have been, yet by his own lights he was a man of honor, incapable of falsehood, even though it were calculated to save his skin. I do not deny that Sir Thomas Picton has described him as a thieving blackguard, but I am sure that this was merely the downright, rather extravagant manner of censure peculiar to that distinguished general, and that those who had taken the expression at its purely literal value have been lacking at once in charity and in knowledge of the caustic, uncompromising terms of speech of General Picton, whom Lord Wellington, you will remember, called a rough, foul-mouthed devil. In further extenuation, it may truthfully be urged that the whole hideous and odious affair was the result of misapprehension, although I cannot go so far as one of Lieutenant Butler's apologists and accept the view that he was the victim of a deliberate plot on the part of his too genial host at Rigoa. That is a misconception easily explained. This host's name happened to be Souza, and the apologist in question has very rashly leapt to the conclusion that he was a member of that notoriously intriguing family, of which the chief members were the Principal Souza, of the Council of Regency at Lisbon, and the Chevalier Souza, Portuguese minister to the court of St. James's. Unacquainted with Portugal, our apologist was evidently in ignorance of the fact that the name of Souza is almost as common in that country as the name of Smith in this. He may also have been misled by the fact that Principal Souza did not neglect to make the utmost capital out of the affair, thereby increasing the difficulties with which Lord Wellington was already contending as a result of incompetence and deliberate malice on the part both of the Ministry at home and of the administration in Lisbon. Indeed. But for these factors, it is unlikely that the affair could ever have taken place at all. If there had been more energy on the part of Mr. Perceval and the members of the cabinet, if there had been less bad faith and self-seeking on the part of the opposition, Lord Wellington's campaign would not have been starved as it was. And if there had been less bad faith and self-seeking, and even more stupid and flagrant kind on the part of the Portuguese Council of Regency, the British Expeditionary Force would not have been left without the stipulated supplies and otherwise hindered at every step. Lord Wellington might have experienced the mental agony of Sir John Moore under similar circumstances 15 months earlier. That he did suffer, and was to suffer yet more, his correspondence shows. But his iron will prevented that suffering from disturbing the equanimity of his mind. The Council of Regency, in its concern to court popularity with the aristocracy of Portugal, might balk his measures by its deliberate supineness. Echoes might reach him of the voices at St. Stephen's that loudly dubbed his dispositions rash, presumptuous, and silly. Catch-halfpenny journalists at home and men of the stamp of Lord Grey might exploit their abysmal military ignorance in reckless criticism and censure of his operations. He knew what a passionate storm of anger and denunciation had arisen from the opposition when he had been raised to the peerage some months earlier, after the glorious victory at Talavera, and how, that victory notwithstanding, it had been proclaimed that his conduct of the campaign was so incompetent as to deserve not reward but punishment. And he was aware of the growing unpopularity of the war in England, knew that the government, ignorant of what he was so laboriously preparing, was chafing at his inactivity of the past few months, so that a member of the cabinet wrote to him exasperatedly, incredibly infatuously, "For God's sake, do something. Anything so that blood be spilt." Lord Wellington might have experienced the mental agony of Sir John Moore under similar circumstances 15 months earlier, that he did suffer, and was to suffer yet more, his correspondence shows. But his iron will prevented that suffering from disturbing the equanimity of his mind. A heart less stout might have been broken, a genius less mighty stifled in this evil tangle of stupidity, incompetence, and malignity that sprang up and flourished about him on every hand. A man less single-minded must have succumbed to exasperation, thrown up his command and taken ship for home, inviting some of his innumerable critics to take his place at the head of the troops and give free rein to the military genius that inspired their critical dissertations. Wellington, however, has been rightly termed of iron, and never did he show himself more of iron than in those trying days of 1810. Stern, but with a passionless sternness, he pursued his way toward the goal he had set himself, allowing no criticism, no censure, no invective so much as to give him pause in his majestic progress. Unfortunately, the lofty calm of the commander-in-chief was not shared by his lieutenants. The light division was quartered along the River Agueda, watching the Spanish frontier, beyond which Marshal Ney was demonstrating against Ciudad Rodrigo, and for lack of funds its fiery-tempered commander, Sir Robert Crawford, found himself at last unable to feed his troops. Exasperated by these circumstances, Sir Robert was betrayed into an act of rashness. He seized some church plate at Pinhel, that he might convert it into rations. It was an act which, considering the general state of public feeling in the country at the time, might have had the gravest consequences, and Sir Robert was subsequently forced to do penance and afford redress. That, however, is another story. I but mention the incident here because the affair at Tavora with which I am concerned may be taken to have arisen directly out of it, and Sir Robert's behavior may be construed as setting an example and thus as affording yet another extenuation of Lieutenant Butler's offense. Our lieutenant was sent upon a foraging expedition into the valley of the Upper Douro, at the head of a half-troop of the 8th Dragoons, 2 squadrons of which were attached at the time to the Light Division. To be more precise, he was to purchase and bring into Pinhel 100 head of cattle, intended some for slaughter and some for draft. His instructions would proceed as far as Rigoa and there report himself to one Bartholomew Bearsley, a prosperous and influential English wine grower, whose father had acquired considerable vineyards in the Douro. He was reminded of the almost hostile disposition of the peasantry in certain districts, warned to handle them with tact and to suffer no straggling on the part of his troopers, and advised to place himself in the hands of Mr. Bearsley for all that related to the purchase of the cattle. Let it be admitted at once that had Sir Robert Crawford been acquainted with Mr. Butler's feather-brained, irresponsible nature, he would have selected any officer rather than our lieutenant to command that expedition. But the Irish Dragoons had only lately come to Pinhel, and the general himself was not immediately concerned. Lieutenant Butler set out on a blustering day of March at the head of his troopers, accompanied by Cornet O'Rourke and 2 sergeants, and at Pesquera he was further reinforced by a Portuguese guide. They found quarters at night at Ervedoza, and early on the morrow they were in the saddle again, riding along the heights above the Quechao de Valeria, through which the yellow, swollen river swirled and foamed along its rocky way. The prospect, formidable even in the full bloom of fruitful and luxuriant summer, was forbidding and menacing now as some imagined gorge of the nether regions. The towering granite heights across the turgid stream were shrouded in mist and sweeping rain, and from the leaden heavens overhead the downpour was a sullen and merciless steadiness, starting at every step a miniature torrent to go swell the roaring waters in the gorge, and drenching the troop alike in body and in spirit. Ahead, swayed to the chin in his blue cavalry cloak, the water streaming from his leather helmet, rode Lieutenant Butler, cursing the weather, the country, the Light Division, and everything else that occurred to him as contributing to his present discomfort. Beside him, astride of a mule, rode the Portuguese guide in a caped cloak of thatched straw, which made him look for all the world like a bottle of his native wine in its straw sheath. Conversation between the two was out of the question, for the guide spoke no English and the lieutenant's knowledge of Portuguese was very far from conversational. Presently the ground sloped, and the troop descended from the heights by a road flanked with dripping pine woods, black and melancholy, that for a while screened them off from the remainder of the sodden world. Thence they emerged near the head of the bridge that spanned the swollen river, and led them directly into the town of Rigoa. Through the mud and clay of the deserted, narrow, unpaved streets the dragoons squelched their way, under a super deluge, for the rain was now reinforced by steady and overwhelming sheets of water, descending on either side from the gutter-shaped tiles that roofed the houses. Inquisitive faces showed here and there behind blurred windows. Odd doors were opened that a peasant family might stare in questioning wonder, and perhaps in some concern, at the sodden pageant that was passing. But in the streets themselves the troopers met no living thing, all the world having scurried to shelter from the pitiless downpour. Beyond the town they were brought by their guide to a walled garden and halted at a gateway. Beyond this could be seen a fair white house set in the foreground of vineyards that rose in terraces up the hillside until they were lost from sight in the lowering veils of mist. Carved on the granite lintel of that gateway, the lieutenant beheld the inscription, Bartholomew Bearsley, 1744, and knew himself at his destination, at the gates of the son or grandson, he knew not which, nor cared, of the original tenant of that wine farm. Mr. Bearsley, however, was from home. The lieutenant was informed of this by Mr. Bearsley's steward, a portly, genial, rather priestly gentleman in smooth black broadcloth, whose name was Sousa, a name which, as I have said, has given rise to some misconceptions. Mr. Bearsley himself had lately left for England, there to wait until the disturbed state of Portugal should be happily repaired. He had been a considerable sufferer from French invasion under Soult, and none may blame him for wishing to avoid a repetition of what already he had undergone, especially now that it was rumored that the Emperor in person would lead the army gathering for conquest on the frontiers. But had Mr. Bearsley been at home, the dragoons could have received no warmer welcome than that which was extended to them by Fernando Sousa. Greeting the lieutenant in intelligible English, he implored him, in the florid manner of the peninsula, to count the house and all within it his own property, and to command whatever he might desire. The troopers found accommodation in the kitchen and in the spacious hall, where great fires of pine logs were piled up for their comfort, and for the remainder of the day they abode there in various states of nakedness, relieved by blankets and straw capotes, what time the house was filled with the steam and stench of their drying garments. Rations had been short of late on the Agueda, and in addition, their weary ride through the rain had made the men sharp-set. Abundance of food was placed before them by the solicitude of Fernando Sousa, and they feasted, as they had not feasted for many months, upon roast kid, boiled rice and golden maize bread, washed down by a copious supply of rough and not too heady wine that the discreet and discriminating steward judged appropriate to their palates and capable of supporting some abuse, akin to the treatment of the troopers in hall and kitchen. But on a nobler scale was the treatment of Lieutenant Butler and Cornet O'Rourke in the dining room. For them a well-roasted turkey took the place of kid, and Sousa went down himself to explore the cellars for a well-sunned, time-ripened Douro table wine, which he vowed, and our dragoons agreed with him, would put the noblest Burgundy to shame. And then with the dessert there was a port the like of which Mr. Butler, who was always a nice taste in wine, and who was coming into some knowledge of port from his residence in the country, had never dreamed existed. For 24 hours the dragoons abode at Mr. Bearsley's quinta, thanking God for the discomforts that had brought them to such comfort, feasting in this land of plenty as only those can feast who have kept a rigid Lent. Nor was this all. The benign Sousa was determined that the sojourn there of these representatives of his country's deliverers should be a complete rest and holiday, not for Mr. Butler to journey to the uplands in this matter of a herd of bullocks. Fernando Sousa had at command a regiment of laborers, who were idle at this time of year, and whom his good nature would engage on behalf of his English guests. Let the lieutenant do no more than provide the necessary money for cattle, and the rest should happen as by enchantment, and Sousa himself would see to it that the price was fair and proper. The lieutenant asked no better. He had no great opinion of himself either as cattle dealer or cattle drover, nor did his ambitions beget in him any desire to excel as one or the other. So he was well content that his host should have the bullocks fetched to Rigoa for him. The herd was driven in on the following afternoon, by when the rain had ceased, and our lieutenant had every reason to be pleased when he beheld the solid beast procured, having disbursed the amount demanded, an amount more reasonable far than he had been prepared to pay. Mr. Butler would have set out forthwith to return to Pinhel, knowing how urgent was the need of the division, and with what impatience the choleric General Crawford would be awaiting him. "Why, so you shall, said the priestly, soothing Sousa. "But first you'll dine. There's good dinner. Ah, but what good dinner? That I have order, and there's a wine. Ah, but you shall give me news of that wine." Lieutenant Butler hesitated. Cornet O'Rourke watched him anxiously, praying that he might succumb to temptation, and attempted suasion in the form of a murmured blessing upon Sousa's hospitality. "Sir Robert will be impatient," demurred the lieutenant. "But half-hour," protested Sousa. "What is half-hour? And in half-hour you will have dined." "True," ventured the cornet, "and it's the devil himself knows when we may dine again. And the dinner is ready. It can be served this instant." "It shall," said Sousa with finality, and pulled the bell rope. Mr. Butler, never dreaming, as indeed how could he, that fate was taking a hand in this business, gave way, and they sat down to dinner. Henceforth you see him the sport of pitiless circumstance. They dined within the half-hour, as Sousa had promised, and they dined exceedingly well. If yesterday the steward had been able, without warning of their coming to spread at short notice, so excellent a feast, conceive what had been accomplished now by preparation. Emptying his fourth and final bumper of rich red Doru, Mr. Butler paid his host a compliment of a sigh and pushed back his chair. But Sousa detained him, waving a hand that trembled with anxiety, and with anxiety stamped upon his benignly rotund and shaven countenance. An instant yet, he implored. Mr. Bearsley would never pardon me did I let you go without what he called a stirrup cup to keep you from the ills that lurk in the wind of the Sarah. A glass, but one, of that port you tasted yesterday. I say but a glass, yet I hope you will do honor to the bottle. But a glass at least. He implored it almost with tears. Mr. Butler had reached that state of delicious torpor in which to take the road is the last agony. But duty was duty, and Sir Robert Crawford had the fiend's own temper. Torn thus between consciousness of duty and the weakness of the flesh, he looked at O'Rourke. O'Rourke, a cherubic fellow, who had for his years a very pretty taste in wine, returned the glance with a moist eye and licked his lips. In your place I should let myself be tempted, says he. It's an elegant wine, and 10 minutes more or less is no great matter. The lieutenant discovered a middle way which permitted him to take a prompt decision creditable to his military instincts, but revealing a disgraceful, though quite characteristic selfishness. Very well, he said. Leave Sergeant Flanagan and 10 men to wait for me, O'Rourke, and do you set out at once with the rest of the troop, and take the cattle with you. I shall overtake you before you have gone very far. O'Rourke's crestfallen air stirred the sympathetic Sousa's pity. But, Captain, he besought, will you not allow the lieutenant? Mr. Butler cut him short. Duty, said he sententiously, is duty. Be off, O'Rourke. And O'Rourke, clicking his heels viciously, saluted and departed. Came presently the bottles in a basket. Not one, as Sousa had said, but 3. And when the first was done, Butler reflected that since O'Rourke and the cattle were already well upon the road, there need no longer be any hurry about his own departure. A herd of bullocks does not travel very quickly, and even with a few hours' start in a 40-mile journey is easily overtaken by a troop of horse traveling without encumbrance. You understand, then, how easily our lieutenant yielded himself to the luxurious circumstances, and disposed himself to savor the second bottle of that nectar distilled from the very sunshine of the Douro. The phrase is his own. The steward produced a box of very choice cigars, and although the lieutenant was not an habitual smoker, he permitted himself on this exceptional occasion to be further tempted. Stretched in a deep chair beside the roaring fire of pine logs, he sipped and smoked and drowsed away the greater part of that wintry afternoon. Soon the third bottle had gone the way of the second, and Mr. Bearsley, steward being a man of extremely temper habit, it follows that most of the wine had found its way down the lieutenant's thirsty gullet. It was perhaps a more potent vintage than he had at first suspected, and as the torpor produced by the dinner and the earlier, fuller wine was wearing off, it was succeeded by an exhilaration that played havoc with the few wits that Mr. Butler could call his own. The steward was deeply learned in wines and wine growing, and in very little besides. Consequently, the talk was almost confined to that subject in its many branches, and he could be interesting enough, like all enthusiasts. To a fresh burst of praise from Butler of the ruby vintage to which he had been introduced, the steward presently responded with a sigh. Indeed, as you say, Captain, a great wine, but we had a greater. Impossible, by God, swore Butler with a hiccup. You may say so, but it is the truth. We had a greater. A wonderful, clear vintage it was, of the year 1798, a famous year on the Douro, the quite most famous year that we have ever known. Mr. Bearsley sells some pipes to the monks at Tavora, who have bottled it and keep it. I begged him at the time not to sell, knowing the value it must come to have one day, but he sell all the same. Ah, meu Deus! The steward clasped his hands and raised rather prominent eyes to the ceiling, protesting to his maker against his master's folly. He say we have plenty, and now, he spread fat hands in a gesture of despair, and now we have none. Some sons of dogs of French, who came with Marshal Soult, happened this way on a forage, they discover the wine, and they guzzle it like pigs. He swore, and his benignity was eclipsed by wrathful memory. He heaved himself up in a passion. Think of that so priceless vintage drink like hogwash, as Mr. Bearsley say, by those goddamn French swine. Not a drop, not a spoonful remain. But the monks at Tavora still have much of what they buy, I am told. They treasure it, for they know good wine. All priests know good wine. Ah, yes, goddamn. He fell into deep reflection. Lieutenant Butler stirred and became sympathetic. "C'est infernal shame," said he indignantly. "I'll know for Jarrett when I meet the French." Then he too fell into reflection. He was a good Catholic, and moreover, a Catholic who did not take things for granted. The sloth and self-indulgence of the clergy in Portugal, being his first glimpse of conventuals in Latin countries, had deeply shocked him. The vows of a monastic poverty that was kept carefully beyond the walls of the monastery offended his sense of propriety. That men who had vowed themselves to pauperism, who wore coarse garments and went barefoot, should batten upon rich food and store up wines that gold could not purchase, struck him as a hideous incongruity. "And the monks drink this nectar?" he said aloud, and laughed sneeringly. "I know the breed. The fair found belly why, fat capon lined. Does your poverty-stricken Capuchin." Sousa looked at him in sudden alarm, bethinking himself that all Englishmen were heretics, and knowing nothing of subtle distinctions between English and Irish. In silence, Butler finished the third and last bottle, and his thoughts fixed themselves with increasing insistence upon a wine reputed better than this of which there was great store in the cellars of the convent at Tavora. Abruptly he asked, "Where's Tavora?" He was thinking perhaps of the comfort that such wine would bring to a company of war-worn soldiers in the valley of the Agueda. "Some 10 leagues from here," answered Sousa, and pointed to a map that hung upon the wall. The lieutenant rose and rolled a thought unsteadily across the room. He was a tall, loose-limbed fellow, blue-eyed, fair-complexioned, with a thatch of fiery red hair excellently suited to his temperament. He halted before the map, and with legs wide apart, to afford him the steadying support of a broad basis. He traced with his finger the course of the Douro, fumbled about the district of Rigoa, and finally hit upon the place he sought. "Why," he said, "seems to me, 'sif we shall ha' come that way, I'd surer road to Pesquera than by the river." "As the bird fly," said Sousa. "But the roads be bad, just mule tracks, while by the river the road is tolerable good." "Yet," said the lieutenant, "I think I shall go back the way." The fumes of the wine were mounting steadily to addle his indifferent brains. Every moment he was seeing things in proportions more and more false. His resentment against priests who, sworn to self-abnegation, hoarded good wine, while soldiers sent to keep harm from priests' fat carcasses were left to suffer cold and even hunger, was increasing with every moment. He would sample that wine at Tavora, and he would bear some of it away that his brother officers at Pinhel might sample it. He would buy it. Oh, yes, there should be no plundering, no irregularity, no disregard of general orders. He would buy the wine and pay for it. But himself he would fix the price, and see that the monks of Tavora made no profit out of their defenders. Thus he thought as he considered the map. Presently, when having taken leave of Fernando Sousa, that prince of hosts, Mr. Butler was riding down to the town with Sergeant Flanagan and 10 troopers at his heels, his purpose deepened and became more fierce. I think the change of temperature must have been to blame. It was a chill, bleak evening. Overhead, across a background of faded blue, scud ragged banks of clouds, the lingering flotsam of the shattered rainstorm of yesterday, and a cavalry cloak afforded but indifferent protection against the wind that blew hard and sharp from the Atlantic. Coming from the genial warmth of Mr. Sousa's parlor into this, the evaporation of the wine within him was quickened. Its fumes mounted now overwhelmingly to his brain, and from comfortably intoxicated that he had been hitherto, the lieutenant now became furiously drunk, and the transition was a very rapid one. It was now that he looked upon the business he had in hand in the light of a crusade. A sort of religious fanaticism began to actuate him. The souls of these wretched monks must be saved. The temptation to self-indulgence, which spelled perdition for them, must be removed from their midst. It was a Christian duty. He no longer thought of buying the wine and paying for it. His one aim now was to obtain possession of it, not merely a part of it, but all of it, and carry it off, thereby accomplishing 2 equally praiseworthy ends: to rescue a convent full of monks from damnation, and to regale the much-enduring half-star campaigners of the Agueda. Thus reasoned Mr. Butler with admirable, if drunken, logic. And reasoning thus, he led the way over the bridge, and kept straight on when he had crossed it, much to the dismay of Sergeant Flanagan, who, perceiving the lieutenant's condition, conceived that he was missing his way. This the sergeant ventured to point out, reminding his officer that they had come by the road along the river. "So we did," said Butler shortly. "Boo, we go back by way of Tavora." They had no guide. The one who had conducted them to Rigoa had returned with O'Rourke, and although Souza had urged upon the lieutenant at parting that he should take one of the men from the Quinta, Butler, with wit enough to see that this was not desirable under the circumstances, had preferred to find his way alone. His confused mind strove now to revisualize the map which he had consulted in Souza's parlor. He discovered, naturally enough, that the task was altogether beyond his powers. Meanwhile, night was descending. They were, however, upon the mule track, which went up and round the shoulder of a hill, and by this they came at dark upon a hamlet. Sergeant Flanagan was a shrewd fellow and perhaps the most sober man in the troop, for the wine had run very freely in Souza's kitchen, too, and the men, whilst awaiting their commander's pleasure, had taken the fullest advantage of an opportunity that was all too rare upon that campaign. Now Sergeant Flanagan began to grow anxious. He knew the peninsula from the days of Sir John Moore, and he knew as much of the ways of the peasantry of Portugal as any man. He knew of the brutal ferocity of which that peasantry was capable. He had seen evidence more than once of the unspeakable fate of French stragglers from the retreating army of Marshal Soult. He knew of crucifixions, mutilations, and hideous abominations practiced upon them in these remote hill districts by the merciless men into whose hands they happened to fall, and he knew that it was not upon French soldiers alone that these abominations had been practiced. Some of those fierce peasants had been unable to discriminate between invader and deliverer. To them a foreigner was a foreigner and no more. Others, who were capable of discriminating, were in the position of having come to look upon French and English with almost equal execration. It is true that whilst the emperor's troops made war on the maxim that an army must support itself upon the country it traverses, thereby achieving a greater mobility, since it was thus permitted to travel comparatively light, the British law was that all things requisitioned must be paid for. Wellington maintained this law in spite of all difficulties at all times with unrelaxing rigidity, and punished with the utmost vigor those who offended against it. Nevertheless, breaches were continual. Men broke out here and there, often, be it said, under stress of circumstances for which the Portuguese were themselves responsible. Plunder and outrage took place and provoked indiscriminating rancor with consequences at times as terrible to stragglers from the British Army of Deliverance as to those from the French Army of Oppressors. Then, too, there was the Portuguese Militia Act recently enforced by Wellington, acting through the Portuguese government, deeply resented by the peasantry upon whom it bore, and rendering them disposed to avenge upon such stray British soldiers as might fall into their hands. Knowing all this, Sergeant Flanagan did not at all relish this night excursion into the hill fastnesses, where at any moment, as it seemed to him, they might miss their way. After all, there were but 12 men all told, and he accounted it a stupid thing to attempt to take a short cut across the hills for the purpose of overtaking an encumbered troop that must of necessity be moving at a very much slower pace. This was the way not to overtake, but to outdistance. Yet since it was not for him to remonstrate with the lieutenant, he kept his peace and hoped anxiously for the best. At the mean wine shop of that hamlet, Mr. Butler inquired his way by the simple expedient of shouting Tavora with a strong interrogative inflection. The vintner made it plain by gestures, accompanied by a rattling musketry of incomprehensible speech, that their way lay straight ahead. And straight ahead they went, following that mule track for some 5 or 6 miles until it began to slope gently towards the plain again. Below them they presently beheld a cluster of twinkling lights to advertise a township. They dropped swiftly down, and in the outskirts overtook a belated bullock cart, whose ungreased axle was arousing the hillside echoes with its plangent wail. Of the vigorous young woman who marched barefoot beside it, shouldering her goad as if it were a pikestaff, Mr. Butler inquired, by his usual method, if this were Tavora, to receive an answer which, though voluble, was unmistakably affirmative. Covento Dominicano was his next inquiry, made after they had gone some little way. The woman pointed with her goad to a massive, dark building, flanked by a little church, which stood just across the square they were entering. A moment later the sergeant, by Mr. Butler's orders, was knocking upon the iron-studded main door. They waited a while in vain. None came to answer the knock. No light showed anywhere upon the dark face of the convent. The sergeant knocked again, more vigorously than before. Presently came timid, shuffling steps. A shutter opened in the door, and the grille thus disclosed was pierced by a shaft of feeble yellow light. A quavering, aged voice demanded to know who knocked. "English soldiers," answered the lieutenant in Portuguese. "Open." A faint exclamation suggestive of dismay was the answer. The shutter closed again with a snap. The shuffling steps retreated, and unbroken silence followed. "Now, whar devil may this mean?" growled Mr. Butler. "Drug wits, like stupid ones, are readily suspicious. Whar are they hatching in here, that they're afraid of luring British soldiers see?" "Knock again, Flanagan." "Louder, man." The sergeant beat the door with the butt of his carbine. The blows gave out a hollow echo, but evoked no more answer than if they had fallen upon the door of a mausoleum. Mr. Butler completely lost his temper. "Seems to me that we stumbled upon a hotbed o' treason." "Hotbed o' treason," he repeated, as if pleased with the phrase. "That's where it is." And he added peremptorily, "Break down the door." "But, sir," began the sergeant in protest, greatly daring. "Break down the door," repeated Mr. Butler. "Let us be, after seeing what these monks are afraid of showing us. I've a notion they're hiding more in their wine." Some of the troopers carried axes precisely against such an emergency as this. Dismounting, they fell upon the door with a will, but the oak was stout, fortified by bands of iron and great iron studs, and it resisted long. The thud of the axes and the crash of rending timbers could be heard from one end of Tavora to the other, yet from the convent it evoked no slightest response. But presently, as the door began to yield to the onslaught, there came another sound to arouse the town. From the belfry of the little church, a bell suddenly gave tongue upon a frantic, hurried note that spoke unmistakably of alarm. Ding, 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 ding it went, a tocsin summoning the assistance of all true sons of Mother Church. Mr. Butler, however, paid little heed to it. The door was down at last, and followed by his troopers, he rode under the massive gateway into the spacious close. Dismounting there, and leaving the woefully anxious sergeant and a couple of men to guard the horses, the lieutenant led the way along the cloisters, faintly revealed by a new-risen moon, towards a gaping doorway whence a feeble light was gleaming. He stumbled over the step into a hall dimly lighted by a lantern swinging from the ceiling. He found a chair, mounted it, and cut the lantern down, then led the way again along an endless corridor, stone-flagged and flanked on either side by rows of cells. Many of the doors stood open, as if in silent token of the tenants' hurried flight, showing what a panic had been spread by the sudden advent of this troop. Mr. Butler became more and more deeply intrigued, more and more deeply suspicious, that here all was not well. Why should a community of loyal monks take flight in this fashion from British soldiers? "Bad luck to them," he growled as he stumbled on. "They may hide as they will, but it's myself, LL run the shavelings to earth." They were brought up short at the end of that long, chill gallery by closed double doors. Beyond these an organ was pealing, and overhead the clapper of the alarm bell was beating more furiously than ever. All realized that they stood upon the threshold of the chapel, and that the conventuals had taken refuge there. Mr. Butler checked upon a sudden suspicion. "Maybe, after all, they've taken us for French," said he. A trooper ventured to answer him. "Best let them see we're not before we have the whole village about our ears." "Damn that bell," said the lieutenant, and added, "Put your shoulders to the door." Its fastenings were but crazy ones, and it yielded almost instantly to their pressure. Yielded so suddenly that Mr. Butler, who himself had been foremost in straining against it, shot forward half a dozen yards into the chapel and measured his length upon its coal flags. Simultaneously from the chancel came a great cry, "Libera nos Domini," followed by a shuddering murmur of prayer. The lieutenant picked himself up, recovered the lantern that had rolled from his grasp, and lurched forward round the angle that hid the chancel from his view. There, huddled before the main altar like a flock of scared and stupid sheep, he beheld the conventuals. Some 200 of them, perhaps, and in the dim light of the heavy altar lamp above them, he could make out the black and white habit of the Order of St. Dominic. He came to a halt, raised his lantern aloft, and called to them peremptorily. "Ho, there!" The organ ceased abruptly, but the bell overhead went clattering on. Mr. Butler addressed him in the best French he could command. "What do you fear? Why do you flee? We are friends, English soldiers, seeking quarters of night." A vague alarm was stirring in him. It began to penetrate his obfuscated mind that perhaps he had been rash, that this forcible rape of a convent was a serious matter. Therefore he attempted this peaceful explanation. From that huddled group, a figure rose and advanced with solemn, stately grace. There was a faint swish of robes, the faint rattle of rosary beads. Something about that figure caught the lieutenant's attention sharply. He craned forward, half sober by the sudden fear that clutched him, his eyes bulging in his face. "I had thought," said a gentle, melancholy woman's voice, "that the seals of a nunnery were sacred to British soldiers." For a moment, Mr. Butler seemed to be laboring for breath. Fully sobered now, understanding of his ghastly error reached him at the gallop. "My God!" he gasped and incontinently turned to flee. But as he fled in horror of his sacrilege, he still kept his head turned, staring over his shoulder at the stately figure of the abbess, either in fascination or with some lingering doubt of what he'd seen and heard. Running thus, he crashed headlong into a pillar, and, stunned by the blow, he reeled and sank unconscious to the ground. This the troopers had not seen, for they had not lingered. Understanding on their own part the horrible blunder, they had turned even as their leader turned, and they had raced madly back the way they had come, conceiving that he followed. And there was reason for their haste other than their anxiety to set a term to the sacrilege of their presence. From the cloistered garden of the convent, uproar reached them, and the metallic voice of Sergeant Flanagan calling loudly for help. The alarm bell of the convent had done its work. The villagers were up, enraged by the outrage, and armed with sticks and scythes and billhooks. An army of them was charging to avenge this infamy. The troopers reached the close no more than in time. Sergeant Flanagan, only half understanding the reason for so much anger, but understanding that this anger was very real and very dangerous, was desperately defending the horses with his two companions against the vanguard of the assailants. There was a swift rush of the dragoons, and in an instant they were in the saddle, all but a lieutenant, of whose absence they were suddenly made conscious. Flanagan had gone back for him, and he had in fact begun to issue an order with that object, when a sudden surge of the swelling, roaring crowd cut off the dragoons from the door through which they had emerged. Sitting their horses, the little troop came together, their sabers drawn, solid as a rock in that angry human sea that surged about them. The moon, riding now clear overhead, irradiated that scene of impending strife. Flanagan, standing in his stirrups, attempted to harangue the mob, but he was at a loss what to say that would appease them, nor able to speak a language they could understand. An angry peasant made a slash at him with a billhook. He parried the blow on his saber, and with the flat of it knocked his assailant senseless. Then the storm burst, and the mob flung itself upon the dragoons. "Bad cess to you," cried Flanagan. "Will ye listen to me, ye murthering villains?" Then in despair, "Char R.G.," he roared, and headed for the gateway. The troopers attempted in vain to reach it. The mob hemmed them about too closely, and then a horrid hand-to-hand fight began, under the cold light of the moon, in that garden consecrated to peace and piety. 2 saddles had been emptied, and the exasperated troopers were slashing now at their assailants with the edge, intent upon cutting a way out of that murderous press. It is doubtful if a man of them would have survived, for the odds were fully 10 to 1 against them. To their aid came now the abbess. She stood on a balcony above and called upon the people to desist and hear her. Then she harangued them for some moments, commanding them to allow the soldiers to depart. They obeyed with obvious reluctance, and at last a lane was opened in that solid, seething mass of angry clods. But Flanagan hesitated to pass down this lane and so depart. 3 of his troopers were down by now, and his lieutenant was missing. He was exercised to resolve where his duty lay. Behind him the mob was solid, cutting off the dragoons from their fallen comrades. An attempt to go back might be misunderstood and resisted, leading to a renewal of the combat, and surely in vain, for he could not doubt but that the fallen troopers had been finished outright. Similarly, the mob stood as solid between him and the door that led to the interior of the convent, where Mr. Butler was lingering alive or dead. A number of peasants had already invaded the actual building, so that in that connection too the sergeant concluded that there was little reason to hope that the lieutenant should have escaped the fate his own rashness had invoked. He had his remaining 7 men to think of, and he concluded that it was his duty under all the circumstances to bring these off alive, and not procure their massacre by attempting fruitless quixotries. So forward, roared the voice of Sergeant Flanagan, and forward went the 7 to the passage that had opened out before them in that hooting, angry mob. Beyond the convent walls, they found fresh assailants awaiting them. Enemies these, who had not been soothed by the gentle, reassuring voice of the abbess. But here there was more room to maneuver. Trot, the sergeant commanded, and soon that trot became a gallop. A shower of stones followed them as they thundered out at Tavora, and the sergeant himself had a lump as large as a duck egg on the middle of his head, when next day he reported himself at Pesquera to Cornet O'Rourke, whom he overtook there. When eventually Sir Robert Crawford heard the story of the affair, he was as angry as only Sir Robert could be. To have lost 4 dragoons and to have set a match to a train that might end in a conflagration was reason and despair. How came such a mistake to be made? He inquired, a scowl upon his full red countenance. Mr. O'Rourke had been investigating and was primed with knowledge. It appears, sir, that at Tavora there's a convent of Dominican nuns, as well as a monastery of Dominican friars. Mr. Butler will have used the word convento, which more particularly applies to the nunnery, and so he was directed to the wrong house. And you say the sergeant has reason to believe that Mr. Butler did not survive his folly? I am afraid there can be no hope, sir. It's perhaps just as well, said Sir Robert, for Lord Wellington would certainly have had him shot. And there you have the true account of the stupid affair of Tavora, which was to produce, as we shall see, such far-reaching effects upon persons nowise concerned in it. Chapter 2. The Ultimatum. News of the affair at Tavora reached Sir Terence O'Moy, the Adjutant General at Lisbon, about a week later in dispatches from headquarters. These informed him that in the course of the humble apology and explanation of the regrettable occurrence offered by the Colonel of the 8th Dragoons in person to the Mother Abbess, it had transpired that Lieutenant Butler had left the convent alive, but that nevertheless he continued absent from his regiment. Those dispatches contained other unpleasant matters of a totally different nature, with which Sir Terence must proceed to deal at once, but their gravity was completely outweighed in the adjutant's mind by this deplorable affair of Lieutenant Butler's. Without wishing to convey an impression that the blunt and downright O'Moy was gifted with any undue measure of shrewdness, it must nevertheless be said that he was quick to perceive what fresh thorns the occurrence was likely to throw in a path that was already thorny enough in all conscience, what a semblance of justification it must give to hostility of the intriguers on the Council of Regency, what a formidable weapon it must place in the hands of Principal Souza and his partisans. In itself, this was enough to trouble a man in O'Moy's position, but there was more. Lieutenant Butler happened to be his brother-in-law, own brother to O'Moy's lovely, frivolous wife. Irresponsibility ran strongly in that branch of the Butler family. For the sake of a young wife whom he loved with a passionate and fearful jealousy, such as is not uncommon in a man of O'Moy's temperament when at his age, he was approaching his 46th birthday. He marries a girl of half his years. The adjutant had pulled his brother-in-law out of many a difficulty, shielded him on many an occasion from the proper consequences of his incurable rashness. This affair of the convent, however, transcended anything that had gone before and proved altogether too much for O'Moy. It angered him as much as it afflicted him, yet when he took his head in his hands and groaned, it was only his sorrow that he was expressing, and it was a sorrow entirely concerned with his wife. The groan attracted the attention of his military secretary, Captain Tremaine, of Fletcher's Engineers, who sat at work at a littered writing table placed in the window recess. He looked up sharply, sudden concern in the strong young face and the steady gray eyes he bent upon his chief. The sight of O'Moy's hunched attitude brought him instantly to his feet. "Whatever is the matter, sir?" "It's that damn fool Richard," growled O'Moy. "He's broken out again." The captain looked relieved. "And is that all?" O'Moy looked at him, white-faced, and in his blue eyes a blaze of that swift passion that had made his name a byword in the army. "Oh," he roared, "you'll say it's enough, by God, when you hear what the fool's been at this time. Violation of a nunnery, no less." And he brought his massive fist down with a crash upon the document that had conveyed the information. With a detachment of dragoons, he broke into the convent of the Dominican nuns at Tavora one night a week ago. The alarm bell was sounded, and the village turned out to avenge the outrage. Consequences: 3 troopers killed, 5 peasants sabred to death, and 7 other casualties. Dick himself missing and reported to have escaped from the convent, but understood to remain in hiding, so that he adds desertion to the other crime, as if that in itself were not enough to hang him. That's all, as you say, and I hope you consider it enough even for Dick Butler. Bad luck to him." "My God," said Captain Tremaine. "I'm glad that you agree with me." Captain Tremaine stared at his chief, the utmost dismay upon his fine young face. "But surely, sir, surely, sir, if this report is correct, some explanation." He broke down, utterly at fault. "To be sure, there's an explanation. You may always depend upon a most elegant explanation for anything that Dick Butler does. His life is made up of mistakes and explanations." He spoke bitterly. He broke into the nunnery under a misapprehension, according to the account of the sergeant who accompanied him, and Sir Terence read out that part of the report. But how is that to help him, and at such a time as this, with public feeling as it is, and Wellington in his present temper about it? The provost's men are beating the country for the blackguard. When they find him at a firing party, he'll have to face. Tremaine turned slowly to the window and looked down the fair prospect of the hillside over a forest of cork oaks alive with fresh green shoots to the silver sheen of the river a mile away. The storms of the preceding week had spent their fury, the travail that had attended the birth of spring, and the day was as fair as a day of June in England. Weaned forth by the generous sunshine, the burgeoning of vine and fig, of olive and cork went on apace, and the skeletons of trees which a fortnight since had stood gaunt and bare were already fleshed in tender green. From the window of this fine conventual house on the heights of Monsanto, above the suburb of Alcantara, where the adjutant general had taken up his quarters, Captain Tremaine stood a moment considering the panorama spread to his gaze from the red-brown roofs of Lisbon on his left, that city which boasted with Rome that was built upon a cluster of 7 hills, to the lines of embarkation that were building about the fort of St. Julian on his left. Then he turned, facing again the spacious, handsome room with its heavy, semi-ecclesiastical furniture, and Sir Terence, who, hunched in his chair at the ponderously carved black writing table, scowled fiercely at nothing. "What are you going to do, sir?" he inquired. Sir Terence shrugged impatiently and heaved himself up in his chair. "Nothing," he growled. "Nothing." The interrogation, which seemed almost to cover reproach, irritated the adjutant. "And what the devil can I do?" he rapped. "You've pulled Dick out of scrapes before now." "I have. That seems to have been my principal occupation ever since I married his sister. But this time he's gone too far. What can I do?" "Lord Wellington is fond of you," suggested Captain Tremaine. "He was your imperturbable young man, and he remained as calm now as O'Moy was excited, although by some 20 years the adjutant's junior. There was between O'Moy and himself, as well as between Tremaine and the Butler family, with which he was remotely connected, a strong friendship which was largely responsible for the captain's present appointment as Sir Terence's military secretary." O'Moy looked at him and looked away. "Yes," he agreed, "but he's still fonder of law and order and military discipline, and I should only be imperiling our friendship by pleading with him for this young blackguard." "The young blackguard is your brother-in-law," Tremaine reminded him. "Bad luck to you, Tremaine, don't I know it? Besides, what is there I can do?" he asked again and ended testily. "Faith, man, I don't know what you're thinking of." "I'm thinking of Una," said Captain Tremaine in that composed way of his, and the words fell like cold water upon the hot iron of O'Moy's anger. The man who can receive with patience a reproach, implicit or explicit, of being wanting in consideration towards his wife is comparatively rare, and never a man of O'Moy's temperament and circumstances. Tremaine's reminder stung him sharply, and the more sharply because of the strong friendship that existed between Tremaine and Lady O'Moy. That friendship had in the past been a thorn in O'Moy's flesh. In the days of his courtship, he had known a fierce jealousy of Tremaine, beholding in him for a time a rival who, with the strong advantage of youth, must in the end prevail. But when O'Moy, putting his fortunes to the test, had declared himself and been accepted by Una Butler, there had been an end to the jealousy, and the old relations of cordial friendship between the men had been resumed. O'Moy had conceived that jealousy of his to have been slain, but there had been times when from its faint, uneasy stirrings he should have taken warning, that it did no more than slumber. Like most warm-hearted, generous, big-natured men, O'Moy was a singular humility where women were concerned, and this humility of his would often breathe a doubt lest in choosing between himself and Tremaine, Una might have been guided by her head rather than her heart, by ambition rather than affection, and that in taking himself she had taken a man who could give her by far the more assured and affluent position. He had crushed down such thoughts as disloyal to his young wife, as ungrateful and unworthy, and at such times he would fall into self-contempt for having entertained them. Then Una herself had revived those doubts 3 months ago, when she had suggested that Ned Tremaine, who was then at Torres Vedras with Colonel Fletcher, was the very man to fill the vacant place of military secretary to the adjutant, if he would accept it. In the reaction of self-contempt, and in a curious surge of pride almost as perverse as his humility, Omoe had adopted her suggestion, and thereafter, in the past 3 months, that is to say, the unreasonable devil of Omoe's jealousy had slept, almost forgotten. Now, by a chance remark whose indiscretion Tremaine could not realize, since he did not so much as suspect the existence of that devil, he had suddenly prodded him into wakefulness. That Tremaine should show himself tender of Lady Omoe's feelings in a matter in which Omoe himself must seem neglectful of them was gall and wormwood to the adjutant. He dissembled it, however, out of a natural disinclination to appear in a ridiculous role of the jealous husband. That, he said, is a matter that you may safely leave to me, and his lips closed tightly upon the words when they were uttered. Oh, quite so, said Tremaine, no whit abashed. He persisted nevertheless. You know Una's feeling for Dick. When I married Una, the adjutant cut in sharply, I did not marry the entire Butler family. It hardened him unreasonably against Dick to have the family cause pleaded in this way. It's sick to death I am of Master Richard and his escapades. He can get himself out of this mess, or he can stay in it. You mean that you'll not lift a hand to help him? Devil a finger, said Omoe, and Tremaine, looking straight into the adjutant's faintly smoldering blue eyes, beheld there a fierce and rancorous determination which he was at a loss to understand, but which he attributed to something outside his own knowledge that must lie between Omoe and his brother-in-law. I am sorry, he said gravely, since that is how you feel. It is to be hoped that Dick Butler may not survive to be taken. The alternative would weigh so cruelly upon Una that I do not care to contemplate it. And who the devil asked you to contemplate it? Snapped Omoe. I am not aware that it is any concern of yours at all. My dear Omoe, it was an exclamation of protest, something between pain and indignation, under the stress of which Tremaine stepped entirely outside of the official relations that prevailed between himself and the adjutant. And the exclamation was accompanied by such a look of dismay and wounded sensibilities that Omoe, meeting this, and noting the honest manliness of Tremaine's bearing and countenance, was there and then the victim of reaction. His warm-hearted and impulsive nature made him at once profoundly ashamed of himself. He stood up, a tall, martial figure, and his ruggedly handsome, shaven countenance reddened under its tan. He held out a hand to Tremaine. My dear boy, I beg your pardon. It's so utterly annoyed I am that the savage in me will be breaking out. Sure, it isn't as if it were only this affair of Dick's. That is almost the least part of the unpleasantness contained in this dispatch. Here, in God's name, read it for yourself, and judge for yourself whether it's in human nature to be patient under so much. With a shrug and a smile to show that he was entirely mollified, Captain Tremaine took the papers to his desk and sat down to con them. As he did so, his face grew more and more grave. Before he had reached the end, there was a tap at the door. An orderly entered with the announcement that Don Miguel Forges had just driven up to Monsanto to wait upon the adjutant general. "Ha!" said Omoe shortly, and exchanged a glance with his secretary. "Show the gentleman up." As the orderly withdrew, Tremaine came over and placed the dispatch on the adjutant's desk. "He arrives very opportunely," he said. "So opportunely as to be suspicious, bedad," said Omoe. He had brightened suddenly, his Irish blood quickening at the immediate prospect of strife which this visit boded. "May the devil admire me, but there's a warm morning in store for Mr. Forges, Ned. Shall I leave you?" "By no means." The door opened, and the orderly admitted Miguel Forges, the Portuguese Secretary of State. He was a slight, dapper gentleman, all in black, from his silk stockings and steel-buckled shoes to his satin stock. His keen aquiline face was swarthy, and the razor had left his chin and cheeks blue-black. His sleek hair was iron-gray. A portentous gravity invested him this morning, as he bowed with profound deference first to the adjutant and then to the secretary. Your Excellencies, he said. He spoke in English that was smooth and fluent for all its foreign accent. Your Excellencies, this is a terrible affair. To what affair will Your Excellency be alluding? Wondered Omoe. Have you not received news of what has happened at Devora? Of the violation of a convent by a party of British soldiers? Of the fight that took place between these soldiers and the peasants who went to succor the nuns? Oh, and is that all? Said Omoe. For a moment, I imagine Your Excellency referred to other matters. I have news of more terrible affairs in the convent business with which to entertain you this morning. That, if you will pardon me, Sir Terence, is quite impossible. You may think so, but you shall judge, bedad. A chair, Don Miguel. The Secretary of State sat down, crossed his knees, and placed his hat in his lap. The other two resumed their seats, Omoe leaning forward, his elbows on the writing table, immediately facing Senor Forges. First, however, he said, to deal with this affair of Devora, the Council of Regency will, no doubt, have been informed of all the circumstances. You will be aware, therefore, that this very deplorable business was a result of a misapprehension, and that the nuns at Devora might very well have avoided all this trouble had they behaved in a sensible, reasonable manner. If instead of shutting themselves up in a chapel and ringing the alarm bell, the Mother Abbess or one of the sisters had gone to the wicket and answered the demand of admittance from the officer commanding the detachment, he would instantly have realized his mistake and withdrawn. What does Your Excellency suggest was this mistake? Inquired the secretary. You have had your report, sir, and surely it was complete. You must know that he conceived himself to be knocking at the gates of the monastery of the Dominican Fathers. Can Your Excellency tell me what was this officer's business at the monastery of the Dominican Fathers? Quoth the secretary, his manner frostily hostile. I am without information on that point, Omoe admitted. No doubt because the officer in question is missing, as you will also have been informed. But I have no reason to doubt that, whatever his business may have been, it was concerned with the interests which are common alike to the British and the Portuguese nation. That is a charitable assumption, Sir Terence. Perhaps you will inform me, Don Miguel, of the uncharitable assumption which the Principal Sousa prefers, snapped Omoe, whose temper began to simmer. A faint color kindled in the cheeks of the Portuguese minister, but his manner remained unruffled. I speak, sir, not with the voice of Principal Sousa, but with that of the entire Council of Regency, and the Council has formed the opinion, which your own words confirm, that His Excellency Lord Wellington is skilled in finding excuses for the misdemeanors of the troops under his command. That, said Omoe, who would never have kept his temper in control, but for the pleasant consciousness that he held a hand of trumps with which he would presently overwhelm this representative of the Portuguese government. That is an opinion for which the Council may presently like to apologize, admitting its entire falsehood. Senor Forges started as if he had been stung. He uncrossed his black silk legs and made as if to rise. Falsehood, sir, he cried in a scandalized voice. It is as well that we should be plain, so as to be avoiding all misconceptions, said Omoe. You must know, sir, and your council must know, that wherever armies move there must be reason for complaint. The British Army does not claim in this respect to be superior to others. Although I don't say, mark me, that it might not claim it with perfect justice. But we do claim for ourselves that our laws against plunder and outrage are as strict as they well can be, and that where these things take place, punishment inevitably follows. Out of your own knowledge, sir, you must admit that what I say is true. True, certainly, where the offenders are men from the ranks. But in this case, where the offender is an officer, it does not transpire that justice has been administered with the same impartial hand. That, sir, answered Omoe sharply, testily, is because he is missing. The secretary's thin lips permitted themselves to curve into the faintest ghost of a smile. Precisely, he said. For answer, Omoe, red in the face, thrust forward the dispatch he had received relating to the affair. Read, sir, read for yourself, that you may report exactly to the Council of Regency the terms of the report that has just reached me from headquarters. You will be able to announce that diligent search is being made for the offender. Forges perused the document carefully and returned it. That is very good, he said, and the council will be glad to hear of it. It will enable us to appease the popular resentment in some degree. But it does not say here that when taken this officer will not be excused upon the grounds which yourself you have urged to me. It does not, But considering that he has since been guilty of desertion, there can be no doubt, all else apart, that the finding of a court-martial will result in his being shot. Very well, said Forges. I will accept your assurance, and the council will be relieved to hear of it. He rose to take his leave. I am desired by the council to express to Lord Wellington the hope that he will take measures to preserve better order among his troops and to avoid the recurrence of such extremely painful incidents. A moment, said Omoe, and rising waved his guest back into his chair, then resumed his own seat. Under a more or less calm exterior, he was a seething cauldron of passion. The matter is not quite at an end, as your excellency supposes. From your last observation, and from a variety of other evidence, I infer that the council is far from satisfied with Lord Wellington's conduct of the campaign. That is an inference which I cannot venture to contradict. You will understand, General, that I do not speak for myself, but for the council, when I say that many of his measures seem to us not merely unnecessary, but detrimental. The power having been placed in the hands of Lord Wellington, the council hardly feels itself able to interfere with his dispositions. But it nevertheless deplores the destruction of the mills and the devastation of the country recommended and insisted upon by his lordship. It feels that this is not warfare as the council understands warfare, and the people share the feelings of the council. It is felt that it would be worthier and more commendable if Lord Wellington were to measure himself in battle with the French, making a definite attempt to stem the tide of invasion on the frontiers. Quite so, said Omoe, his hand clenching and unclenching, and Tremaine, who watched him, wondered how long it would be before the storm burst. Quite so, and because the council disapproves of the very measures which at Lord Wellington's instigation it has publicly recommended, it does not trouble to see that those measures are carried out. As you say, it does not feel itself able to interfere with his dispositions, but it does not scruple to mark its disapproval by passively hindering him at every turn. Magistrates are left to neglect these enactments, and because, he added with bitter sarcasm, Portuguese valor is so red-hot and so devilish set on battle, the militia acts, calling all men to the colors are forgotten as soon as published. There is no one either to compel the recalcitrant to take up arms, or to punish the desertions of those who have been driven into taking them up. Yet you want battles. You want your frontiers defended. A moment, sir. There is no need for heat, no need for any words. The matter may be said to be at an end. He smiled, a thought viciously, be it confessed, and then played his trump card, hurled his bombshell. Since the views of your council are in such utter opposition to the views of the commander-in-chief, you will no doubt welcome Lord Wellington's proposal to withdraw from this country and to advise His Majesty's government to withdraw the assistance which is affording you. There followed a long spell of silence, Omoe sitting back in his chair, his chin in his hand, to observe the result of his words. Nor was he in the least disappointed. Don Miguel's mouth fell open. The color slowly ebbed from his cheeks, leaving them an ivory yellow. His eyes dilated and protruded. He was consternation incarnate. "My God!" he contrived to gasp at last, and his shaking hands clutched at the carved arms of his chair. "You don't seem as pleased as I expected," ventured Omoe. "But, General, surely His Excellency cannot mean take so terrible a step?" "Terrible to whom, sir?" wondered Omoe. "Terrible to us all." Forges rose in his agitation. He came to lean upon Omoe's writing table, facing the adjutant. "Surely, sir, our interests, England's interests and Portugal's, are one in this." "To be sure. But England's interests can be defended elsewhere than in Portugal, and it is Lord Wellington's view that they shall be. He has already warned the Council Regency that, since His Majesty and the Prince Regent have entrusted him with the command of the British and Portuguese armies, he will not suffer the Council or any of its members to interfere with his conduct of the military operations, or suffer any criticism or suggestion of theirs to alter system formed upon mature consideration. But when, finding their criticisms fail, the members of the Council, in their wrong-headedness, in their anxiety to allow private interest to triumph over public duty, go the length of thwarting the measures of which they do not approve, the end of Lord Wellington's patience has been reached. I am giving your Excellency his own words. He feels that it is futile to remain in a country whose government is determined to undermine his every endeavor to bring this campaign to a successful issue. Yourself, sir, you appear to be distressed, but the Council of Regency will no doubt take a different view. It will rejoice in the departure of a man whose military operations it finds so detestable. You will no doubt discover this when you come to lay Lord Wellington's decision before the council, as I now invite you to do. Bewildered and undecided, Forges stood there for a moment, vainly seeking words. Finally, "Is this really Lord Wellington's last word?" he asked in tones of profoundest consternation. "There is one alternative, one only," said Omoe slowly. "And that—" Instantly Forges was all eagerness. Omoe considered him. "Faith, I hesitate to state it. No, no, please, please. I feel that it is idle. Let the council judge. I implore you, General, let the council judge." "Very well." Omoe shrugged and took up a sheet of the dispatch which lay before him. "You will admit, sir, I think, that the beginning of these troubles coincided with the advent of the Principal Souza upon the Council of Regency." He waited in vain for a reply. Forges, the diplomat, preserved an uncompromising silence, in which presently Omoe proceeded. "From this, and from other evidence, of which indeed there is no lack, Lord Wellington has come to the conclusion that all the resistance, passive and active, which he has encountered, results from the Principal Souza's influence upon the council. You will not, I think, trouble to deny it, sir." Forges spread his hands. "You will remember, General," he answered, in tones of conciliatory regret, "that the Principal Souza represents a class upon whom Lord Wellington's measures bear in a manner peculiarly hard." "You mean that he represents the Portuguese nobility and landed gentry, who, putting their own interests above those of the state, have determined to oppose and resist the devastation of the country which Lord Wellington recommends." "You put it very bluntly," Forges admitted. "You will find Lord Wellington's own words even more blunt," said Omoe with a grim smile, and turned to the dispatch he held. "Let me read you exactly what he writes. As for Principal Souza, I beg you to tell him from me that as I have had no satisfaction in transacting the business of this country, since he has become a member of the government, no power on earth shall induce me to remain in the peninsula if he is either to remain a member of the government or to continue in Lisbon. Either he must quit the country, or I will do so, and this immediately after I have obtained His Majesty's permission to resign my charge." The adjutant put down the letter and looked expectantly at the Secretary of State, who returned the look with one of utter dismay. Never in all his career had the diplomat been so completely dumbfounded as he was now by the simple directness of the man of action. In himself, Don Miguel Forges was both shrewd and honest. He was shrewd enough to apprehend to the full the military genius of the British commander-in-chief, fruits of which he had already witnessed. He knew that the withdrawal of Junot's army from Lisbon 2 years ago resulted mainly from the operations of Sir Arthur Wellesley, as he was then, before his supersession, in the supreme command of that first expedition, and he more than suspected that, but for that supersession, the defeat of the first French army of invasion might have been even more signal. He had witnessed the masterly campaign of 1809, the Battle of the Douro, and the relentless operations which had culminated in hurling the shattered fragments of Soult's magnificent army over the Portuguese frontier, thus liberating that country for the second time from the thrall of the mighty French invader. And he knew that unless this man and the troops under his command remained in Portugal and enjoyed complete liberty of action, there could be no hope of stemming the third invasion for which Messina, the ablest of all the emperor's marshals, was now gathering his divisions in the north. If Wellington were to execute his threat and withdraw with his army, Forges beheld nothing but ruin for his country. The irresistible French would sweep forward in devastating conquest, and Portuguese independence would be ground to dust under the heel of the terrible emperor. All this the clear-sighted Don Miguel Forges now perceived. To do him full justice, he had feared for some time that the unreasonable conduct of his government might ultimately bring about some such desperate situation. But it was not for him to voice those fears. He was a servant of that government, the mere instrument and mouthpiece of the Council of Regency. "This," he said at length in a voice that was awed, "is an ultimatum. It is that—" Omoe admitted readily. Forges sighed, shook his dark head, and drew himself up like a man who has chosen his part. Being shrewd, he saw the immediate necessity of choosing, and being honest, he chose honestly. "Perhaps it is as well," he said. "That Lord Wellington should go?" cried Omoe. "That Lord Wellington should announce intentions of going," Forges explained. And having admitted so much, He now stripped off the official mask completely. He spoke with his own voice and not with that of the council whose mouthpiece he was. Of course it will never be permitted. Lord Wellington has been entrusted with the defense of the country by the Prince Regent. Consequently, it is the duty of every Portuguese to ensure that at all costs he shall continue in that office. Omoe was mystified. Only a knowledge of the minister's inmost thoughts could have explained this oddly sudden change of manner. But your excellency understands the terms. The only terms upon which his lordship will so continue? Perfectly. I shall hasten to convey those terms to the council. It is also quite clear, is it not, that I may convey to my government, and indeed publish your complete assurance that the officer responsible for the raid on the convent at Tavora will be shot when taken. Looking intently into Omoe's face, Don Miguel saw the clear blue eyes flicker under his gaze. He beheld a gray shadow slowly overspreading the adjutant's ruddy cheek. Knowing nothing of the relationship between Omoe and the offender, unable to guess the sources of the hesitation of which he now beheld such unmistakable signs, the minister naturally misunderstood it. "There must be no flinching in this, General," he cried. "Let me speak to you for a moment quite frankly and in confidence, not as the Secretary of State of the Council of Regency, but as a Portuguese patriot who places his country and his country's welfare above every other consideration. You have issued your ultimatum. It may be harsh, it may be arbitrary, with that I have no concern. The interests, the feelings of Principal Souza or of any other individual, however high-placed, are without weight when the interests of the nation hang against them in the balance. Better that an injustice be done to one man than that the whole country should suffer. Therefore, I do not argue with you upon the rights and wrongs of Lord Wellington's ultimatum. That is a matter apart. Lord Wellington demands a removal of Principal Souza from the government, or, in the alternative, proposes himself to withdraw from Portugal. In the national interest, the government can come to only one decision. I am frank with you, General. Myself, I shall stand range on the side of the national interest, and what my influence in the council can do it shall do. But if you know Principal Souza at all, you must know that he will not relinquish his position without a fight. He has friends and influence. The Patriarch of Lisbon and many of the nobility will be on his side. I warn you solemnly against leaving any weapon in his hands." He paused impressively. But Omoe, gray-faced now and haggard, waited in silence for him to continue. "From a message I brought you," Forges resumed, "you have perceived how Principal Souza has fastened upon this business at Tavora to support his general censure of Lord Wellington's conduct of the campaign. That is the weapon to which my warning refers. You must, if we who place the national interest supreme are prevail, you must disarm him by the assurance that I ask for. You will perceive that I am disloyal to a member of my council, so that I may be loyal to my country. But I repeat, I speak to you in confidence. This officer has committed a gross outrage, which must bring the British Army into odium with the people. Unless we have your assurance that the British Army is the first to censure and to punish the offender with the utmost rigor, give me now, that I may publish everywhere, your official assurance that this man will be shot. And on my side, I assure you that Principal Souza, thus deprived of his stoutest weapon, must succumb to the struggle that awaits us." "I hope," said Omoe slowly, his head bowed, his voice dull and even unsteady, "I hope that I am not behind you in placing public duty above private consideration. You may publish my official assurance that the officer in question will be shot when taken. General, I thank you. My country thanks you. You may be confident of this issue." He bowed gravely to Omoe and then to Tremaine. "Your Excellencies, I have the honor to wish you good day." He was shown out by the orderly who had admitted him, and he departed well satisfied in his patriotic heart that the crisis, which he had always known to be inevitable, should have been reached at last. Yet as he went, he wondered why the adjutant general had looked so downcast, why his voice had broken when he pledged his word that justice should be done upon the offending British officer. That, however, was no concern of Don Miguel's, and it was more than enough to engage his thoughts when he came to consider the ultimatum to his government with which he was charged. Chapter 3. Lady Omoe. Across the frontier in the northwest was gathering the Third Army of Invasion, some 60,000 strong, commanded by Marshal Messina, Prince of Esslingen, the most skillful and fortunate of all Napoleon's generals, a leader who, because he had never known defeat, had come to be surnamed by his emperor the dear child of victory. Wellington, at the head of a British force of little more than one-third of the French host, watched and waited, maturing his stupendous strategic plan, which those in whose interests had been conceived had done so much to thwart. That plan was inspired by and based upon the emperor's maxim that war should support itself, that an army on the march must not be hampered and immobilized by its commissariat, but that it must draw its supplies from the country it is invading, that it must, in short, live upon that country, behind the British army and immediately to the north of Lisbon, in an arc some 30 miles long, following the inflection of the hills from the sea at the mouth of the Zizandra to the broad waters of the Tagus at Alhandra. The lines of Torres Vedras were being constructed under the direction of Colonel Fletcher, and this so secretly and with such careful measures as to remain unknown to British and Portuguese alike. Even those employed upon the works knew of nothing save the section upon which they happened to be engaged, and had no conception of the stupendous and impregnable whole that was preparing. To these lines it was the British commander's plan to effect a slow retreat before the French flood, when it should sweep forward, thus luring the enemy onward into a country which he commanded should be laid relentlessly waste, that there that enemy might fast be starved and afterwards destroyed. To this end had his proclamations gone forth, commanding that all the land lying between the rivers Tagus and Mondego, in short, the whole of the country between Beira and Torres Vedras, should be stripped naked, converted into a desert as stark and empty as the Sahara. Not a head of cattle, not a grain of corn, not a skin of wine, not a flask of oil, not a crumb of anything affording nourishment should be left behind. The very mills were to be rendered useless, bridges were to be broken down, the houses emptied of all property, which the refugees would carry away with them from the line of invasion. Such was his terrible demand upon the country for its own salvation. But such, as we have seen, was not war as Principal Souza and some of his adherents understood it. They had not the foresight to perceive the inevitable result of this strategic plan, if effectively and thoroughly executed. They did not even realize that the devastation had better be effected by the British in its defensive, and in its results at the same time overwhelmingly offensive, manner than by the French in the course of a conquering onslaught. They did not realize these things partly because they did not enjoy Wellington's full confidence, and in a greater measure because they were blinded by self-interest, because, as Omoe told Forges, they placed private considerations above public duty. The northern nobles whose lands must suffer opposed the measure violently. They even opposed the withdrawal of labor from those lands which the Militia Act had rendered necessary. And Antonio de Souza made himself their champion until he was broken by Wellington's ultimatum to the council. For broken he was. The nation had come to a parting of the ways. It had been brought to the necessity of choosing, and however much the principal, voicing the outcry of his party, might argue that the British plan was as detestable and ruinous as a French invasion, the nation preferred to place its confidence in the conqueror of Amero and the Douro. Souza quitted the government and the capital as had been demanded, but if Wellington hoped that he would quit intriguing, he misjudged his man. He was a fellow of monstrous vanity, pride, and self-sufficiency, of the sort in which there is none more dangerous to offend. His wounded pride demanded a salve to be procured at any cost. The wound had been administered by Wellington, and must be returned with interest. So that he ruined Wellington, it mattered nothing to Antonio that to Souza that he should ruin himself and his own country at the same time. He was like some blinded, ferocious, and unreasoning beast, ready, even eager, to sacrifice its own life, so that in dying it could destroy its enemy and slake its bloodthirst. In that mood he passes out of the councils of the Portuguese government into a brooding and secretly active retirement, of which the fruits shall presently be shown. With his departure, the Council of Regency, rudely shaken by the ultimatum which had driven him forth, became more docile and active, and for a season the measures enjoined by the commander-in-chief were pursued with some show of earnestness. As a result of all this, life at Monsanto became easier, and Omoe was able to breathe more freely, and to devote more of his time to matters concerning the fortifications which Wellington had left largely in his charge. Then, too, as the weeks passed, the shadow overhanging it with regard to Richard Butler gradually lifted. No further word had there been of the missing lieutenant, and by the enemy both Omoe and Tremaine had come to conclusion that he must have fallen into the hands of some of the ferocious mountaineers to whom a soldier, whether his uniform were British or French, was a thing to be done to death. For his wife's sake Omoe came thankfully to that conclusion, Under the circumstances, it was the best possible termination to the episode. She must be told of her brother's death presently, when evidence of it was forthcoming. She would mourn him passionately, no doubt, for her attachment to him was deep, extraordinarily deep for so shallow a woman. But at least she would be spared the pain and shame she must inevitably have felt had he been taken and shot. Meanwhile, however, the lack of news from him, in another sense, would have to be explained to him as sooner or later, for a fitful correspondence was maintained between brother and sister, and Omoe dreaded the moment when this explanation must be made. Lacking invention, he applied to Tremaine for assistance, and Tremaine glumly supplied him with a necessary lie that should meet Lady Omoe's inquiries when they came. In the end, however, he was spared the necessity of falsehood, for the truth itself reached Lady Omoe in an unexpected manner. It came about a month after that day when Omoe had first received news of the escapade at Tavora. It was a resplendent morning of early June, and the adjutant was detained a few moments from breakfast by the arrival of a mail bag from headquarters, now established at Vizu, leaving Captain Tremaine to deal with it. Sir Terence went down to breakfast, bearing with him only a few letters of a personal character which had reached him from friends on the frontier. The architecture of the house at Monsanto was of a semi-claustral character. 3 sides of it enclosed a sheltered, luxuriant garden, whilst on the 4th side a connecting corridor, completing the quadrangle, spanned bridgewise the spacious archway through which admittance was gained directly from the parklands that sloped gently to Alcantara. This archway, closed at night by enormous wooden doors, opened wide during the day upon a grassy terrace bounded by a baluster of white marble that gleamed now in the brilliant sunshine. It was Omoe's practice to breakfast out of doors in that genial climate, and during April, before the sun had reached its present intensity, the table had been spread out there upon the terrace. Now, however, it was wiser, even in the early morning, to seek the shade, and breakfast was served within the quadrangle, under a trellis of vines supported in the Portuguese manner by rough-hewn granite columns. It was a delicious spot, cool and fragrant, secluded without being enclosed, since the broad archway commanded a view of the Tagus and the hills of Alemtejo. Here Omoe found himself impatiently awaited that morning by his wife and her cousin, Sylvia Armitage, more recently arrived from England. "You are very late," Lady Omoe greeted him petulantly. Since she spent her life in keeping other people waiting, it naturally fretted her to discover unpunctuality in others. Her portrait by Rayburn, which now adorns the National Gallery, had been painted in the previous year. You will have seen it, or at least you will have seen one of its numerous replicas, and you will have remarked its singular, delicate, rose-petal loveliness. The gleaming golden head, the flawless outline of face and feature, the immaculate skin, the dark blue eyes with their look of innocence awakening. Thus was she now in her artfully simple gown of flowered muslin with its white fichu folded across her neck that was but a shade less white. Thus was she, just as Rayburn had painted her, saving, of course, that her expression, matching her words, was petulant. I was detained by the arrival of a mail-bag from Vizu. Sir Terence excused himself, as he took the chair which Mullins, the elderly pontifical butler, drew out for him. Ned is attending to it, and will be kept for a few moments yet. Lady Omoe's expression quickened. "Are there no letters for me?" "None, my dear, I believe." "No word from Dick?" Again there was that note of ever-ready petulance. "It is too provoking. He should know that he must make me anxious by his silence. Dick is so thoughtless, so careless of other people's feelings. I shall write to him severely." The adjutant paused in the act of unfolding his napkin. The prepared explanation trembled on his lips, but its falsehood, repellent to him, was not uttered. "I should certainly do so, my dear," was all he said, and addressed himself to his breakfast. "What news from headquarters?" Miss Armitage asked him, "Are things going well?" "Much better now that Principal Sousa's influence is at an end. Cotton reports that the destruction of the mills in the Mondego Valley is being carried out systematically." Miss Armitage's dark, thoughtful eyes became wistful. "Do you know, Terence," she said, "that I am not without some sympathy for the Portuguese resistance to Lord Wellington's decrees. They must bear so terribly hard upon the people. To be compelled with their own hands to destroy their homes and lay waste the lands upon which they have labored. What could be more cruel? War can never be anything but cruel. he answered gravely. God help the people over whose lands it sweeps. Devastation is often the least of the horrors marching in its train. Why must war be? She asked him, in intelligent rebellion against that most monstrous and infamous of all human madnesses. Omoe proceeded to do his best to explain the unexplainable, and since, himself professional soldier, he could not take the sane view of a sane young questioner, hot argument ensued between them, to the infinite weariness of Lady Omoe, who out of self-protection gave herself to the study of the latest fashion plates from London and the consideration of a gown for the ball which the Count Redondo was giving in the following week. It was thus in all things, for these cousins represented the two poles of womanhood. Miss Armitage, without any of Lady Omoe's insistent and excessive femininity, was nevertheless feminine to the core, but hers was the Diana type of womanliness. She was tall and of a clean-limbed, supple grace, now emphasized by the riding habit which she was wearing, for she had been in the saddle during the hour which Lady Omoe had consecrated to the rites of toilet and devotions done before her mirror. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, vivacity and intelligence lent her countenance an attraction very different from the allurement of her cousin's delicate loveliness. And because her countenance was a true mirror of her mind, she argued shrewdly now, so shrewdly that she drove Omoe to entrench himself behind generalizations. My dear Sylvia, war is most merciful where it is most merciless, he assured her with the Irish gift for paradox. At home in the government itself, there are plenty who argue as you argue, and who are wondering when we shall embark for England. That is because they are intellectuals, and war is a thing beyond the understanding of intellectuals. It is not intellect, but brute instinct and brute force that will help humanity in such a crisis as the present. Therefore, let me tell you, my child, that a government of intellectual men is the worst possible government for a nation engaged in a war. This was far from satisfying Miss Armitage. Lord Wellington himself was an intellectual, she objected. Nobody could deny it. There was the work he had done as Irish secretary, and there was the calculating genius he had displayed at Vomero, at Oporto, at Talavera, and then, observing her husband to be in distress, Lady Omoe put down her fashion plate and brought up her heavy artillery to relieve him. Sylvia, dear, she interpolated, I wonder that you will forever be arguing about things you don't understand. Miss Armitage laughed good-humoredly. She was not easily put out of countenance. What woman doesn't? She asked. I don't, and I am a woman, surely. Ah, but an exceptional woman. Her cousin rallied her affectionately, tapping the shapely white arm that protruded from a foam of lace. And Lady Omoe, to whom words never had any but a literal meaning, set herself to purr precisely as one would have expected. Complacently she discoursed upon the perfection of her own endowments, appealing ever and anon to her husband for confirmation, and Omoe, who loved her with all the passionate reverence which nature working inscrutably to her end so often inspires in just such strong, essentially masculine men for just such fragile and excessively feminine women, afforded this confirmation with all the enthusiasm of sincere conviction. Thus until Mullins broke in upon them with the announcement of a visit from Count Samoval, an announcement more welcome to Lady Omoe than to either of her companions. The Portuguese nobleman was introduced. He had attained to a degree of familiarity in the adjutant's household that permitted of his being received without ceremony there at that breakfast table spread in the open. He was a slender, handsome, swarthy man of 30, scrupulously dressed, as graceful and elegant in his movements as a fencing master, which indeed he might have been, for his skill with the foils was a matter of pride to himself and notoriety to all the world. Nor was it by any means the only skill he might have boasted, for Geronimo de Samoval was in many things a very subtle, supple gentleman. His friendship with the Omoes, now some 3 months old, had been considerably strengthened of late by the fact that he had unexpectedly become one of the most hostile critics of the Council Regency as lately constituted, and one of the most ardent supporters of the Wellingtonian policy. He bowed with supremest grace to the ladies, ventured to kiss the fair, smooth hand of his hostess, undeterred by the frosty stare of Omoe's blue eyes, whose approval of all men was in inverse proportion to their approval of his wife, and finally proffered her the armful of early roses that he brought. These poor roses of Portugal to their sister from England, said his softly caressing tenor voice. Ye a poet, said Omoe tartly. Having found Castalia here, said the Count, shall I not drink its limpid waters? Not, I hope, while there's an agreeable vintage of port on the table. A morning wet, Samoval. Omoe invited him, taking up the decanter. 2 fingers, then no more. It is not my custom in the morning. But here, to drink your lady's health and yours, Miss Armitage. With a graceful flourish of his glass, he pledged them both and sipped delicately, then took the chair that Omoe was proffering. Good news, I hear, General. Antonio de Souza's removal from the government is already bearing fruit. The mills in the valley of the Mondego are being effectively destroyed at last. Yuri, very well informed, grunted Omoe, who himself had but received the news. As well informed, indeed, as I myself. There was a note almost of suspicion in the words, and he was vexed that matters which it was desirable be kept screened as much as possible from general knowledge should so soon be put abroad. Naturally, and with reason, was the answer, delivered with a rueful smile. Am I not interested? Is not some of my property in question? Samoval sighed, but I bow to the necessities of war. At least it cannot be said of me, as was said of those whose interests Sousa represented, that I put private considerations above public duty. That is the phrase, I think. The individual must suffer that the nation may triumph. A Roman maxim, my dear General. And a British one, said Omoe, to whom Britain was a second Rome. Oh, admitted, replied the amiable Samoval. You proved it by your uncompromising firmness in the affair at Tavora. What was that? Inquired Miss Armitage. Have you not heard? Cried Samoval in astonishment. Of course not, snapped Omoe, who had broken into a cold perspiration. Hardly a subject for the ladies' count. Rebuked for his intention, Samoval submitted instantly. Perhaps not, he agreed, as if dismissing it, whereupon Omoe recovered from his momentary breathlessness. But in your own interests, my dear General, I trust there will be no weakening when this Lieutenant Butler is caught. And who? Sharp and stridently came that single word from her ladyship. Desperately, Omoe sought to defend the breach. Nothing to do with Dick, my dear. A fellow named Philip Butler. Who? But the too well-informed Samoval corrected him. Not Philip, General. Richard Butler. I had the name but yesterday from Forges. In the scared hush that followed, the Count perceived that he had stumbled headlong into a mystery. He saw Lady Omoe's face turn whiter and whiter, saw her sapphire eyes dilating as they regarded him. Richard Butler, she echoed. What of Richard Butler? Tell me at once. Hesitating before such signs of distress, Samoval looked at Omoe to meet a dejected scowl. Lady Omoe turned to her husband. What is it? She demanded. You know something about Dick, and you are keeping it from me. Dick is in trouble? He is, Omoe admitted, in great trouble. What has he done? You spoke an affair at Tavora or Tavora, which is not to be mentioned before ladies. I demand to know. Her affection and anxiety for her brother invested her for a moment with a certain dignity, lent her a force that was but rarely displayed by her. Seeing the men stricken speechless, Samoval from bewildered astonishment, Omoe from distress, she jumped to the conclusion, after what had been said, that motives of modesty accounted for their silence. Leave us, Sylvia, please, she said. Forgive me, dear, but you see they will not mention these things while you are present. She made a piteous little figure as she stood trembling there, her fingers tearing in agitation at one of Samoval's roses. She waited until the obedient and discreet Miss Armitage had passed from view into a wing that contained the adjutant's private quarters, then sinking limp and nerveless to her chair. Now, she bade them, please tell me. And Omoe, with a sigh of regret for the lies so laboriously concocted, which would never now be uttered, delivered himself huskily of the hideous truth. Chapter 4. Count Samoval. Miss Armitage's own notions of what might be fit and proper for her virginal ears were by no means coincident with Lady Omoe's. Thus, although you have seen her pass into the private quarters of the adjutant's establishment, and although, in fact, she did withdraw to her own room, she found it impossible to abide their prey to doubt and misgivings as to what Dick Butler might have done. Doubt and misgivings, be understood, entertained purely on Una's account and not at all on Dick's. by the corridor spanning the archway on the southern side of the quadrangle, and serving as a connecting bridge between the adjutant's private and official quarters, Miss Armitage took her way to Sir Terence's workroom, knowing that she would find Captain Tremaine there, and assuming that he would be alone. "May I come in?" she asked him from the doorway. He sprang to his feet. "Why, certainly, Miss Armitage." For so imperturbable a young man, he seemed oddly breathless in his eagerness to welcome her. "Are you looking for Omoe? He left me nearly half an hour ago to go to breakfast, and I was just about to follow." "I scarcely dare detain you, then." "On the contrary. I mean, not at all. But were you wanting me?" She closed the door and came forward into the room, moving with that supple grace peculiarly her own. "I want you to tell me something, Captain Tremaine, and I want you to be frank with me. I hope I could never be anything else. I want you to treat me as you would treat a man, a friend of your own sex." Tremaine sighed. He had recovered from the surprise of her coming, and was again his imperturbable self. "I assure you that is the last way in which I desire to treat you. But if you insist—" "I do." She had frowned slightly at the earlier part of his speech, with its subtle, half-jesting gallantry, and she spoke sharply now. "I bow to your will," said Captain Tremaine. "What has Dick Butler been doing?" He looked into her face with sharply questioning eyes. "What was it that happened at Tavora?" He continued to look at her. "What have you heard?" he asked at last. "Only that he has done something at Tavora for which the consequences, I gather, may be grave. I am anxious for Una's sake to know what it is." "Does Una know?" "She is being told now. Count Samoval let slip just what I have outlined, and she has insisted upon being told everything." "Then why did you not remain to hear?" "Because they sent me away on the plea that— oh, on the silly plea of my youth and innocence, which were not to be offended. But which you expect me to offend?" "No, because I can trust you to tell me without offending." "Sylvia." It was a curious exclamation of satisfaction and of gratitude for the implied confidence. We must admit that it betrayed a selfish forgetfulness of Dick Butler and his troubles, but it is by no means clear that it was upon such grounds that it offended her. She stiffened perceptibly. "Really, Captain Tremaine." "I beg your pardon," said he, "but you seem to imply—" He checked at a loss. Her color rose. "Well, sir, what do you suggest that I implied, or seemed to imply?" But as suddenly her manner changed. "I think we are too concerned with trifles where the matter on which I have sought you is a serious one." "It is of the utmost seriousness," he admitted gravely. "Won't you tell me what it is?" He told her quite simply the whole story, not forgetting to give prominence to the circumstances extenuating it in Butler's favor. She listened with a deepening frown, rather pale, her head bowed. "And when he is taken," she asked, What will happen to him?" "Let us hope that he will not be taken." "But if he is," she insisted almost impatiently. Captain Tremaine turned aside and looked out of the window. "I should welcome the news that he is dead," he said softly. "For if he is taken, he will find no mercy at the hands of his own people." "You mean that he will be shot?" Horror charged her voice, dilated her eyes. Inevitably, a shudder ran through her, and she covered her face with her hands. When she withdrew, then Tremaine beheld the lovely countenance transformed. It was white and drawn. "But surely Terence can save him," she cried piteously. He shook his head, his lips tight pressed. "There is no man less able to do so." "What do you mean? Why do you say that?" He looked at her, hesitating for a moment, then answered her. "Omoe has pledged his word to the Portuguese government that Dick Butler shall be shot when taken." "Terence did that?" "He was compelled to it. Honor and duty demanded no less of him. I alone, who was present and witnessed the undertaking, know what it cost him and what he suffered. But he was forced to sink all private considerations. It was a sacrifice rendered necessary, inevitable for success of this campaign." And he proceeded to explain to her all the circumstances that were interwoven with Lieutenant Butler's ill-timed defense. "Thus you see that from Terence you can hope for nothing. His honor will not admit of his wavering in this matter." "Honor?" She uttered the word almost with contempt. "And what of Una?" "I was thinking of Una when I said I should welcome the news of Dick's death somewhere in the hills. It is the best that can be hoped for. I thought you were Dick's friend, Captain Tremaine. Why? So I've been. So I am. Perhaps that is another reason why I should hope that he is dead. Is it no reason why you should do what you can to save him? He looked at her steadily for an instant, calm under the reproach of her eyes. Believe me, Miss Armitage, if I saw a way to save him, to do anything to help him, I should seize it, both for the sake of my friendship for himself and because of my affection for Una. Since you yourself are interested in him, that is an added reason for me. But it is one thing to admit willingness to help, and another thing actually to afford help. What is there that I can do? I assure you that I have thought of the matter. Indeed, for days I have thought of little else. But I can see no light. I await events. Perhaps a chance may come. Her expression had softened. I see. She put out a hand generously to ask forgiveness. I was presumptuous, and I had no right to speak as I did. He took the hand. I should never question your right to speak to me in any way that seemed good to you, he assured her. I had better go to Una. She will be needing me. Poor child. I am grateful to you, Captain Tremaine, for your confidence and for telling me. And thus she left him very thoughtful, as concerned for Una as she was herself. Now, Una Omoi was a natural product of such treatment. There had ever been something so appealing in her lovely helplessness and fragility that all her life others had been concerned to shelter her from every wind that blew. Because it was so she was what she was, and because she was what she was it would continue to be so. But Lady Omoi at the moment did not stand in such urgent need of Miss Armitage as Miss Armitage imagined. She had heard the appalling story of her brother's escapade, but she had been unable to perceive in what it was so terrible as it was declared. He had made a mistake. He had invaded the convent under a misapprehension for which it was ridiculous to blame him. It was a mistake which any man might have made in a foreign country. Lives have been lost, it is true, but that was owing to stupidity of other people, of the nuns who had run for shelter when no danger threatened save in their own silly imaginations, and of the peasants who had come blundering to their assistance where no assistance was required. The latter were the people responsible for the bloodshed, since they had attacked the dragoons. Could it be expected of the dragoons that they should tamely suffer themselves to be massacred? Thus Lady Omoi upon the affair of Tavora. The whole thing appeared to her to be rather silly, and she refused seriously to consider that it could have any grave consequences for Dick. His continued absence made her anxious, but if he should come to be taken, surely his punishment would be merely a formal matter. At the worst he might be sent home, which would be a very good thing, for after all the climb of the peninsula had never quite suited him. In this fashion she nimbly pursued a train of vitiated logic, passing from inconsequence to inconsequence. And Omoi, thankful that she should take such a view as this, mercifully hopeful that the last had been heard of his peccant and vexatious brother-in-law, content, more than content, to leave her comforted such illusions. And then, while she was still discussing the matter in terms of comparative calm, came an orderly to summon him away, so that he left her in the company of Samoval. The Count had been deeply shocked by the discovery that Dick Butler was Lady Omoyet's brother, and a little confused that he himself in his ignorance should have been the means of bringing to her knowledge a painful matter that touched her so closely, and that hitherto had been so carefully concealed from her by her husband. He was thankful that she should take so optimistic a view, and quick to perceive Omoyet's charitable desire to leave her optimism undispelled. But he was no less quick to perceive the opportunities which the circumstances afforded him to further a certain deep intrigue upon which he was engaged. Therefore he did not take his leave just yet. He sauntered with Lady Omoi on the terrace above the wooded slopes that screened the village of Alcantara, and there discovered her mind to be even more frivolous and unstable than his perspicuity had hitherto suspected. Under stress, Lady Omoi could convey the sense that she felt deeply. She could be almost theatrical in her displays of emotion, but these were as transient as they were intense. Nothing that was not immediately present to her senses was ever capable of a deep impression upon her spirit, and she had the facility characteristic of the self-loving and self-indulgent of putting aside any matter that was unpleasant. Thus, easily self-persuaded, as we have seen, that this escapade of Richard's was not to be regarded too seriously, and that its consequences were not likely to be grave, she chattered with Gay in consequence of other things, of the dinner party last week at the house of Marquis of Minas, that prominent member of the Council of Regency, of the forthcoming ball to be given by the Count of Redondo of the latest news from home, the latest fashion, and the latest scandal, the amours of the Duke of York and the shortcomings of Mr. Perceval. Sam Oval, however, did not intend that the matter of her brother should be so entirely forgotten, so lightly treated. Deliberately at last he revived it, considering her as she leaned upon the granite balustrade, her pink sunshade aslant over her shoulder, her flimsy lace shawl festooned from the crook of either arm, and floating behind her, a wisp of cloudy vapor. Sam Oval permitted himself a sigh. She flashed him a sidelong glance, arch and rallying. "You are melancholy, sir." "A poor compliment," she told him. "But do not misunderstand her. Hers was an almost childish coquetry, inevitable fruit of her intense femininity, craving ever the worship of the sterner sex and the incense of its flattery. And Sam Oval, after all, young, noble, handsome, with a half-sinister reputation, was something of a figure of romance, as a good many women had discovered to their cost. He fingered his snowy stock, and bent upon her eyes of glowing adoration. "Dear Lady Omoe," his tenor voice was soft and soothing as a caress, "I sigh to think that one so adorable, so entirely made for life's sunshine and gladness, should have cause for a moment's uneasiness, perhaps for secret grief, at the thought of the peril of her brother." Her glance clouded under this reminder. Then she pouted and made a little gesture of impatience. "Dick is not in peril," she answered. "He is foolish to remain so long in hiding, and of course he will have to face unpleasantness when he is found. But to say that he is in peril is just nonsense. Terence said nothing of peril. He agreed with me that Dick will probably be sent home. Surely you don't think—" "No, no." He looked down, studying his Hessians for a moment. Then his dark eyes returned to meet her own. "I shall see to it that he is in no danger. You may depend upon me, who ask but the happy chance to serve you. Should there be any trouble, let me know at once, and I will see to it that all is well. Your brother must not suffer, since he is your brother. He is very blessed and enviable in that." She stared at him, her brows knitting. "But I don't understand. Is it not plain? Whatever happens, you must not suffer, Lady Omoe. No man of feeling, and I least of any, could endure it. And since if your brother were to suffer, that must bring suffering to you, you may count upon me to shield him. You are very good, Count, but shield him from what? From whatever may threaten." The Portuguese government may demand in self-protection, to appease the clamor of the people stupidly outraged by this affair, that an example shall be made of the offender. "Oh, but how could they? With what reason?" She displayed a vague alarm, and a less vague impatience of such hypotheses. He shrugged. "The people are like that. A fierce, vengeful God to whom appeasing sacrifices must be offered from time to time. If the people demand a scapegoat, governments usually provide one. But be comforted." In his eagerness of reassurance, he caught her delicate mittened hand in his own, and her anxiety, rendering her heedless, she allowed it to lie there gently imprisoned. "Be comforted. I shall be here to guard him. There is much that I can do, and you may depend upon me to do it. For your sake, dear lady, the government will listen to me. I would not have you imagine me capable of boasting. I have influence with the government, that is all. And I give you my word that so far as the Portuguese government is concerned, your brother shall take no harm." She looked at him for a long moment with moist eyes, moved and flattered by his earnestness and intensity of homage. "I take this very kindly in you, sir. I have no thanks that are worthy," she said, her voice trembling a little. "I have no means of repaying you. You have made me very happy, Count." He bent low over the frail hand he was holding. "Your assurance that I have made you happy repays me very fully, since your happiness is my tenderest concern. Believe me, dear lady, you may ever count Geronimo de Samoval your most devoted and obedient slave." He bore the hand to his lips and held it to them for a long moment, whilst with heightened color and eyes that sparkled more, be it confessed, from excitement than from gratitude, she stood passively considering his bowed dark head. As he came erect again, a movement under the archway caught his eye, and turning he found himself confronting Sir Terence and Miss Armitage, who were approaching. If it vexed him to have been caught by a husband notoriously jealous, in an attitude not altogether uncompromising, Sam Oval betrayed no sign of it. With smooth self-possession, he hailed Omoe. "General, You come in time to enable me to take my leave of you. I was on the point of going. So I perceived, said Omoi tartly. He had almost said, so I had hoped. His frosty manner would have imposed constraint upon any man less master of himself than Samoval. But the Count ignored it, and ignoring it delayed a moment to exchange amiabilities politely with Miss Armitage, before taking at last an unhurried and unperturbed departure. But no sooner was he gone than Omoi expressed himself full frankly to his wife. I think Sam Oval is becoming too attentive and too assiduous. He is a dear, said Lady Omoi. That is what I mean, replied Sir Terence grimly. He has undertaken that if there should be any trouble with the Portuguese government about Dick's silly affair, he will put it right. Oh, said Omoi, that was it. And out of his tender consideration for her said no more. But Sylvia Armitage, knowing what she knew from Captain Tremaine, was not content to leave the matter there. She reverted to it presently as she was going indoors alone with her cousin. Una, she said gently, I should not place too much faith in Count Samoval and his promises. What do you mean? Lady Omoi was never very tolerant of advice, especially from an inexperienced young girl. I do not altogether trust him, nor does Terence. Pooh! Terence mistrusts every man who looks at me. My dear, never marry a jealous man, she added with her inevitable inconsequence. He is the last man, the Count, I mean, to whom, in your place, I should go for assistance if there is trouble about Dick. She was thinking of what Tremaine had told her the attitude of the Portuguese government, and her clear-sighted mind perceived an obvious peril in permitting Count Samoval to become aware of Dick's whereabouts should they ever be discovered. What nonsense, Sylvia. You conceive the oddest and most foolish notions sometimes. But of course you have no experience of the world. And beyond that, she refused to discuss the matter, nor did the wise Sylvia insist. Chapter 5. The Fugitive. Although Dick Butler might continue missing in the flesh, in the spirit he and his miserable affairs seemed to have been ever present and ubiquitous, and a most fruitful source of trouble. It would be at about this time that there befell in Lisbon the deplorable event that nipped in the bud the career of that most promising young officer, Major Berkeley of the famous Diehards, the 29th Foot, coming into Lisbon on leave from his regiment, which was stationed at Abrantes and formed part of the division under Sir Rowland Hill. The Major happened into a company that contained at least one member who was hostile to Lord Wellington's conduct of the campaign, or rather to the measures which it entailed. As in the case of the Principal Souza, prejudice drove him to take up any weapon that came to his hand by means of which he could strike a blow at a system he deplored. Since we are concerned only indirectly with the affair, it may be stated very briefly. The young gentleman in question was a Portuguese officer and a nephew of the Patriarch of Lisbon, and particular criticism to which Major Berkeley took such just exception concerned the very troublesome Dick Butler. Our patrician ventured to comment with sneers and innuendos upon the fact that the lieutenant of dragoons continued missing, and he went so far as to indulge in a sarcastic prophecy that he never would be found. Major Berkeley, stung by the slur thus slyly cast upon British honor, invited the young gentleman to make himself more explicit. I had thought that I was explicit enough, says young impudence, leering at the stalwart redcoat. But if you want it more clearly still, then I mean that the undertaking to punish this ravisher of nunneries is one that you English have never intended to carry out. To save your faces, you will take good care that Lieutenant Butler is never found. Indeed, I doubt if he was ever really missing. Major Berkeley was quite uncompromising and downright. I am afraid he had none of the graces that can exalt one of these affairs. You're just a very foolish liar, sir, and you deserve a good caning, was all he said. But the way in which he took his cane from under his arm was so suggestive of more to follow there, and then that several of the company laid preventive hands upon him instantly. The Patriarch's nephew, very white and very fierce to hear himself addressed in terms which, out of respect for his august and powerful uncle, had never been used to him before, demanded instant satisfaction. He got it next morning in the shape of half an ounce of lead through his foolish brain, and a terrible uproar ensued. To appease it, a scapegoat was necessary. As Sam Oval so truly said, the mob is a ferocious god to whom sacrifices must be made. In this instance, the sacrifice, of course, was Major Berkeley. He was broken and sent home to cut his pigtail. The adornment still clung to by the 29th, and retire into private life, whereby the British Army was deprived of an officer of singularly brilliant promise. Thus, you see, the score against poor Richard Butler, that foolish victim of wine and circumstance, went on increasing. But in my haste to usher Major Berkeley out a narrative which he touches merely at a tangent, I am guilty of violating the chronological order of the events. The ship in which Major Berkeley went home to England in the rural life was a frigate Telemachus, and the Telemachus had but dropped anchor in the Tagus at the date with which I am immediately concerned. She came with certain stores and a heavy load of mails for the troops, and it would be a full fortnight before she would sail again for home. Her officers would be ashore during the time, the welcome guests of the officers of the garrison, bearing their share in the gaieties with which the latter strove to kill the time of waiting for events, and Marcus Glennie, the captain of the frigate, an old friend of Tremaine's, was by virtue of that friendship an almost daily visitor at the adjutant's quarters. But there again I am anticipating. The Telemachus came to her moorings in the Tagus, at which for the present we may leave her, on the morning of the day that was to close with Count Redondo's semi-official ball. Lady O'Moy had risen late, taking from one end of the day what she must relinquish to the other, that thus fully rested she might look her best that night. The greater part of the afternoon was devoted to preparation. It was amazing even to herself what amount of detail there was to be considered, and from Sylvia she received but very indifferent assistance. There were times when she regretfully suspected in Sylvia a lack of proper womanliness, a taint almost of masculinity. There was to Lady O'Moy's mind something very wrong about a woman who preferred a canter to a waltz. It was unnatural, it was suspicious. She was not quite sure that it wasn't vaguely immoral. At last there had been dinner, to which she came a full half-hour late, but so ravishing and angelic an appearance that the sight of her was sufficient to mollify Sir Terence's impatience and stifle the withering sarcasms he had been laboriously preparing. After dinner, which was taken at 6 o'clock, there was still an hour to spare before the carriage would come to take them into Lisbon. Sir Terence pleaded stress of work, occasioned by the arrival of the Telemachus that morning, and withdrew with Tremaine to the official quarters, to spend that hour in disposing of some of the many matters awaiting his attention. Sylvia, who to Lady O'Moy's exasperation seemed now for the first time to give a thought to what she should wear that night, went off in haste to gown herself, and so Lady O'Moy was left to her own resources, which I assure you were few indeed. The evening being calm and warm, she sauntered out into the open. She was more or less annoyed with everybody, with Sir Terence and Tremaine for their assiduity to duty, and with Sylvia for postponing all thought of dressing until this 11th hour, when she might have been better employed in beguiling her ladyship's loneliness. In this petulant mood, Lady O'Moy crossed the quadrangle, loitered a moment by the table and chairs placed under the trellis, and considered sitting there to await the others. Finally, however, attracted by the glory of the sunset behind the hills toward the Brants, she sauntered out onto the terrace, to the intense thankfulness of a poor wretch who had waited there for the past 10 hours in the almost despairing hope that precisely such a thing might happen. She was leaning upon the balustrade when a rustle in the pines below drew her attention. The rustle worked swiftly upwards and round to the bushes on her right, and her eyes, faintly startled, followed its career, what time she stood tense and vaguely frightened. Then the bushes parted and a limping figure that leaned heavily upon a stick disclosed itself, a shaggy, red-bearded man in the garb of a peasant, and marvel of marvels, this figure spoke her name sharply, warningly almost, before she had time to think of screaming. Una, don't move." The voice was certainly the voice of Mr. Butler. But how came that voice into the body of this peasant? Terrified, with drumming pulses, yet obedient to the injunction, she remained without speech or movement. Whilst crouching so as to keep below the level of the balustrade, the man crept forward until he was immediately before and below her. She stared into that haggard face, and through the half-mask of stubbly beard gradually made out the features of her brother. Richard! The name broke from her in a scream. S.H. He waved his hands in wild alarm to repress her. "For God's sake, be quiet. It's a ruined man I am if they find me here. You'll have heard what's happened to me." She nodded and uttered a half-strangled yes. "Is there anywhere you can hide me? Can you get me into the house without being seen? I am almost starving and my leg is on fire. I was wounded 3 days ago to make matters worse than they were already. I have been lying in the woods there watching for the chance to find you alone since sunrise this morning, and it's devil a bite or sup I've had since this time yesterday. Poor Richard. She leaned down towards him in an attitude of compassionate, ministering grace. But why? Why did you not come up to the house and ask for me? No one would have recognized you. Terence would have seen me. But Terence wouldn't have mattered. Terence will help you. Terence. He almost laughed from excessive bitterness, laboring under an egotistical sense of wrong. He's the last man I should wish to meet, as I have good reason to know. If it hadn't been for that I should have come to you a month ago, immediately after this trouble of mine. As it is, I kept away until despair left me no other choice. Una, on no account a word of my presence to Terence. But he's my husband. Sure, and he's also adjutant general. And if I know him at all, he's the very man to place official duty and honor and all the rest of the above family considerations. Oh, Richard, how little you know Terence. How wrong you are to misjudge him like this. Right or wrong, I prefer not to take the risk. It might end in my being shot one fine morning before long. Richard, for God's sake, less of your Richard. It's all the world will be hearing you. Can you hide me? Do you think for a day or two? If you can't, I'll be after shifting for myself as best I can. I've been playing the part of an English overseer from Bearsley's wine farm, and it has brought me all the way from the Douro in safety. But the strain of it and the eternal fear of discovery are beginning to break me. And now there's this infernal wound. I was assaulted by a footpad near Brant's, as if I was worth robbing. Anyhow, I gave the fellow more than I took. Unless I have rest, I think I shall go mad and give myself up to the provost marshal to be shot and done with. Why do you talk of being shot? You have done nothing to deserve that. Why should you fear it? Now Mr. Butler was aware, having gathered the information lately on his travels, of the undertaking given by the British to the Council of Regency with regard to himself. But irresponsible egotist though he might be, yet in common with others, he was actuated by the desire which his sister's fragile loveliness inspired in every one to spare her unnecessary pain or anxiety. It's not myself will take any risks, he said again. We are at war, and when men are at war, killing becomes a sort of habit, and one life more or less is neither here nor there. And upon that he renewed his plea that she should hide him if she could, and that on no account should she tell a single soul, and Sir Terence least of any, of his presence. Having driven him to the verge of frenzy by the waste of precious moments in vain argument, she gave him at last the promise he required. Go back to the bushes there, she bade him, and wait until I come for you. I will make sure that the coast is clear. Contiguous to her dressing room, which overlooked the quadrangle, there was a small alcove which had been converted into a storeroom for the array of trunks and dress boxes that Lady Omoe had brought from England. A door opening directly from her dressing room communicated with this alcove, and of that door Bridget, her maid, was in possession of the key. As she hurried now indoors, she happened to meet Bridget on the stairs. The maid announced herself on her way to supper in the servants' quarters, and apologized for her presumption in assuming that her ladyship would no further require her services that evening. But since it fell in so admirably with her ladyship's own wishes, she insisted with quite unusual solicitude, with vehemence almost, that Bridget should proceed upon her way. Just give me the key of the alcove, she said. There are one or two things I want to get. Can I get them, your ladyship? Thank you, Bridget. I prefer to get them myself. There was no more to be said. Bridget produced a bunch of keys, which she surrendered to her mistress, having picked out for her the one required. Lady Omoe went up, to come down again the moment that Bridget had disappeared. The quadrangle was deserted, the household disposed of, and it wanted yet half an hour to the time for which the carriage was ordered. No moment could have been more propitious. But in any case, no concealment was attempted, since, if detected, it must have provoked suspicions hardly likely to be aroused in any other way. When Lady Omoe returned indoors in the gathering dusk, she was followed at a respectful distance by the limping fugitive, who might, had he been seen, have been supposed some messenger, or perhaps some person employed about the house or gardens coming to her ladyship for instructions. No one saw them, however, and they gained the dressing room and thence the alcove in complete safety. There, whilst Richard, allowing his exhaustion at last to conquer him, sank heavily down upon one of his sister's many trunks, recking nothing of the havoc wrought in its priceless contents, her ladyship all a tremble collapsed limply upon another. but there was no rest for her. Richard's wound required attention, and he was faint for want of meat and drink. So having procured him the wherewithal to wash and dress his hurt, a nasty knife slash which had penetrated the bone of his thigh, the very sight of which turned her ladyship sick and faint, she went to forage for him in a haste increased by the fact that time was growing short. On the dining room sideboard, from the remains of dinner, she found and furtively abstracted what she needed: best part of roast chicken, a small loaf, and a half flask of collars. Mullins, the butler, would no doubt be exercised presently when he discovered the abstraction. Let him blame one of the footmen, Sir Terence's orderly, or the cat. It mattered nothing to Lady O'Moy. Having devoured the food and consumed the wine, Richard's exhaustion assumed the form of a lethargic torpor. To sleep was now his overmastering desire. She fetched him rugs and pillows, and he made himself a couch upon the floor. She had demurred, of course, when he himself had suggested this. She could not conceive of anyone sleeping anywhere but in a bed, but Dick made short work of that illusion. "Haven't I been in hiding for the last 6 weeks?" he asked her. "And haven't I been thankful to sleep in a ditch? And wasn't I campaigning before that? I tell you I couldn't sleep in a bed. It's a habit I've lost entirely." Convinced, she gave way. "We'll talk tomorrow, Una," he promised her, as he stretched himself luxuriously upon that hard couch. "But meanwhile, on your life, not a word to anyone. You understand?" "Of course I understand, my poor Dick." She stooped to kiss him, but he was fast asleep already. She went out and locked the door, and when on the point of setting out for Count Redondo's, she returned a bunch of keys to Bridget. The key of the alcove was missing. "I shall require it again in the morning, Bridget," she explained lightly, and then added kindly, as it seemed, "Don't wait for me, child. Get to bed. I shall be late in coming home, and I shall not want you." Chapter 6. Miss Armitage's Pearls. Lady O'Moy and Miss Armitage drove alone together into Lisbon. The adjutant, still occupied, would follow as soon as he possibly could, whilst Captain Tremaine would go on directly from the lodgings which he shared in Alcantara with Major Carruthers, also the adjutant's staff, whither he had ridden to dress some 20 minutes earlier. "Are you ill, Una?" had been Sylvia's concerned greeting of her cousin when she came within the range of the carriage lamps. "You are pale as a ghost." To this her ladyship had replied mechanically that a slight headache troubled her. But now that they sat side by side in the well-upholstered carriage, Miss Armitage became aware that her companion was trembling. "Una, dear, whatever's the matter?" Had it not been for the dominant fear that the shedding of tears would render her countenance unsightly, Lady O'Moy would have yielded to her feelings and wept. Heroically in the cause of her own flawless beauty, she conquered the almost overmastering inclination. I have been so troubled about Richard," she faltered. "It is preying upon my mind." "Poor dear." In sheer motherliness, Miss Armitage put an arm about her cousin and drew her close. "We must hope for the best. Now, if you have understood anything of the character of Lady O'Moy, you will have understood that the burden of a secret was the last burden that such a nature was capable of carrying. It was because Dick was fully aware of this that he had so emphatically and repeatedly impressed upon her necessity for saying not a word to anyone of his presence. She realized in her vague way, or rather she believed it since he had assured her, that there would be grave danger to him if he were discovered. But discovery was one thing, and the sharing of a confidence as to his presence another. That confidence must certainly be shared. Lady O'Moy was in an emotional maelstrom that swept her toward the cataract. The cataract might inspire her with dread, standing as it did for death and disaster, but the maelstrom was not to be resisted. She was helpless in it, unequal to breasting such strong waters. She who in all her futile, charming life had been born snugly in safe crafts that were steered by others, remained but to choose her confidant. Nature suggested Terence, but it was against Terence in particular that she had been warned. Circumstance now offered Sylvia Armitage, but pride, or vanity if you prefer it, denied her here. Sylvia was an inexperienced young girl, as she herself had so often found occasion to remind her cousin. Moreover, she fostered the fond illusion that Sylvia looked to her for precept, that upon Sylvia's life she exercised a precious guiding influence. How, then, should the supporting lean upon the supported? Yet since she must, there and then, lean upon something or succumb instantly and completely, She chose a middle course, a sort of temporary assistance. I have been imagining things, she said. It may be a premonition, I don't know. Do you believe in premonitions, Sylvia? Sometimes, Sylvia humored her. I have been imagining that if Dick is hiding a fugitive, he might naturally come to me for help. I am fanciful, perhaps, she added hastily, lest she should have said too much. But there it is. All day the notion has clung to me, and I have been asking myself desperately what I should do in such a case. Time enough to consider it when it happens. Una, after all, I know. Her ladyship interrupted on that ever-ready note of petulance of hers. I know, of course. But I think I should be easier in my mind if I could find an answer to my doubt. If I knew what to do, to whom to appeal for assistance, for I am afraid that I should be very helpless myself. There is Terence, of course, but I am a little afraid of Terence. He has got Dick out of so many scrapes, and he is so impatient of poor Dick. I am afraid he doesn't understand him, and so I should be a little frightened of appealing to Terence again. No, said Sylvia gravely. I shouldn't go to Terence. Indeed, he is the last man to whom I should go. You say that too, exclaimed her ladyship. Why? Quoth Sylvia sharply. Who else has said it? There was a brief pause in which Lady Omoe shuddered. She had been so near to betraying herself. How very quick and shrewd Sylvia was. She made, however, a good recovery. Myself, of course. It is what I have thought myself. There is Count Samoval. He promised that if ever any such thing happened, he would help me, and he assured me I could count upon him. I think it may have been his offer that made me fanciful. I should go to Sir Terence before I went to Count Samoval, by which I mean that I should not go to Count Samoval at all under any circumstances. I do not trust him. You said so once before, dear, said Lady Omoe, and you assured me that I spoke out of the fullness of my ignorance and inexperience. Ah, forgive me. There is nothing to forgive. No, doubt you were right. But remember that instinct is most alive in the ignorant and inexperienced, and that instinct is often a surer guide than reason. Yet if you want reason, I can supply that too. Count Samoval is the intimate friend of the Marquis of Minas, who remains a member of the government, and who next to Principal Sousa was, and no doubt is, the most bitter opponent of the British policy in Portugal. Yet Count Samoval, one of the largest landowners in the north, and the nobleman who had perhaps suffered most severely from that policy, represents himself as its most vigorous supporter. Lady Omoe listened in growing amazement. Also, she was a little shocked. It seemed to her almost indecent that a young girl should know so much about politics, so much of which she herself, a married woman, and the wife of the adjutant general, was completely in ignorance. Save us, child, she ejaculated. You are so extraordinarily informed. I have talked to Captain Tremaine, said Sylvia. He has explained all this. Extraordinary conversation for a young man to hold with a young girl. Pronounce her ladyship. Terence never talked of such things to me. Terence was too busy making love to you, said Sylvia, and there was the least suspicion of regret in her almost boyish voice. That may account for it, her ladyship confessed, and fell for a moment into consideration of that delicious and rather amusing past, when Omoe's ferocious hesitancy and flaming jealousy had delighted her with the full perception of her beauty's power. With a rush, however, the present forced itself back upon her notice. But I still don't see why Count Samoval should have offered me assistance if he did not intend to grant it when the time came. Sylvia explained that it was from the Portuguese government that the demand for justice upon the violator of the nunnery at Tavora emanated, and that Samoval's offer might be calculated to obtain him information of Butler's whereabouts when they became known, so that he might surrender him to the government. My dear! Lady Omoe was shocked almost beyond expression. How you must dislike the man to suggest that he could be such a Judas. I do not suggest that he could be. I warn you never to run the risk of testing him. He may be as honest in this matter as he pretends. But if ever Dick would come to you for help, you must take no risk. The phrase was a happier one than Sylvia could suppose. It was almost the very phrase that Dick himself had used, and its reiteration by another bore conviction to her ladyship. To whom then should I go? She demanded plaintively. And Sylvia, speaking with knowledge, remembering the promise that Tremaine had given her, answered readily. There is but one man whose assistance you could safely seek. Indeed, I wonder you should not have thought of him in the first instance, since he is your own, as well as Dick's lifelong friend. Ned Tremaine?" Her ladyship fell into thought. "Do you know, I am a little afraid of Ned. He is so very sober and cold. You do mean Ned, don't you?" "Whom else should I mean? But what could he do?" "My dear, how should I know? But at least I know, for I think I can be sure of this, that he will not lack the will to help you. And to have the will, in a man like Captain Tremaine, is to find a way." The confident, almost respectful, tone in which he spoke arrested her ladyship's attention. It promptly sent her off at a tangent. "You like Ned, don't you, dear?" "I think everybody likes him." Sylvia's voice was now studiously cold. "Yes, but I don't mean quite in that way." And then, before the subject could be further pursued, the carriage rolled to a standstill in a flood of light from gaping portals, scattering a mob of curious sightseers, intersprinkled with chairmen, footmen, linkmen, and all the valetaille that hovers about the functions of the great world. The carriage door was flung open and the steps let down. A brace of footmen, plump as capons, in gorgeous liveries, bowed powdered heads and proffered scarlet arms to assist the ladies to alight. Above, in the crowded, spacious, colonnaded vestibule at the foot of the great staircase, they were met by Captain Tremaine, who had just arrived with Major Carruthers, both resplendent in full dress, and Captain Marcus Glennie of the Telemachus in blue and gold. Together they ascended the great staircase, lined with chatting groups, and ablaze with uniforms, military, naval, and diplomatic, British and Portuguese, to be welcomed above by the Count and Countess of Redondo. Lady Omoia's entrance to the ballroom produced the effect to which custom had by now inured her. Soon she found herself the center of assiduous attentions. Cavalrymen in blue, riflemen in green, scarlet officers of the line regiments, winged light infantrymen, rakishly policed, gold-braided hussars, and all the smaller fry of court and camp fluttered insistently about her. It was no novelty to her, who had been the recipient of such homage since her first ball 5 years ago at Dublin Castle, and yet the wine of it had gone ever to her head a little. But tonight she was rather pale and listless, her rose-petal loveliness emphasized thereby, perhaps. An unusual air of indifference hung about her, as she stood there amid this throng of martial jostlers who craved the honor of a dance, and at whom she smiled a thought mechanically over the top of her slowly moving fan. The first quadrille impended, and the senior service had carried off the prize from under the noses of the landsmen. As she was swept away by Captain Glennie, she came face to face with Tremaine, who was passing with Sylvia on his arm. She stopped and tapped his arm with her fan. "You haven't asked to dance, Ned," she reproached him. With reluctance I abstained. "But I don't intend that you shall. I have something to say to you." He met her glance and found it oddly serious, most oddly serious for her. Responding to it in entreaty, he murmured a promise in courteous terms of delight at so much honor. But either he forgot the promise or did not conceive of redemption to be an urgent matter. For the quadrille being done, he sauntered to one of the crowded anterooms with Miss Armitage and brought her to the cool of a deserted balcony above the garden. Beyond this was the river, agleam with the lights of the British fleet that rode at anchor on its placid bosom. "Una will be waiting for you," Miss Armitage reminded him. She was leaning on the sill of the balcony, standing erect beside her. He considered the graceful profile sharply outlined against a background of gloom by the light from the windows behind them. A heavy curl of her dark hair lay upon a neck as flawlessly white as the rope of pearls that swung from it, with which her fingers were now idly toying. It were difficult to say which most engaged his thoughts, the profile, the lovely line of neck, or the rope of pearls. These latter were of price, such things as it might seldom, and then only by sacrifice, lie within the means of Captain Tremaine to offer to the woman whom he took to wife. He so lost himself upon that train of thought that she was forced to repeat her reminder. "Una will be waiting for you, Captain Tremaine." "Scarcely as eagerly," he answered, "as others will be waiting for you." She laughed amusedly, a frank, boyish laugh. "I thank you for not saying as eagerly as I am waiting for others. Miss Armitage, I have ever cultivated truth. But we are dealing with surmise." "Oh, no surmise at all. I speak of what I know. And so do I." And yet again she repeated, "Una will be waiting for you." He sighed and stiffened slightly. "Of course, if you insist." said he, and made ready to reconduct her. She swung round as if to go, but checked and looked him frankly in the eyes. "Why will you forever be misunderstanding me?" she challenged him. "Perhaps it is the inevitable result of my over-anxiety to understand. Then begin by taking me more literally, and do not read into my words more meaning than I intend to give them. When I say Una is waiting for you, I state a simple fact, not a command that you shall go to her. Indeed, I want first to talk to you. If I might take you literally now, should I have suffered you to bring me here if I did not?" "I beg your pardon," he said contrite, and something shaken out of his imperturbability. "Sylvia," he ventured very boldly, and there checked, so terrified as to be ashamed of his brave scarlet, gold-laced uniform. "Yes," she said. She was leaning upon the balcony again, and in such a way now that he could no longer see her profile. But her fingers were busy at the pearls once more, and this he saw, and seeing, recovered himself. "You have something to say to me?" he questioned in his smooth, level voice. Had he not looked away as he spoke, he might have observed that her fingers tightened their grip of the pearls almost convulsively, as if to break the rope. It was a gesture slight and trivial, yet arguing perhaps vexation. But Tremaine did not see it, and had he seen it, it is odds would have conveyed no message to him. There fell a long pause, which he did not venture to break. At last she spoke, her voice quiet and level as his own had been. "It is about Una." "I had hoped," he spoke very softly, "that it was about yourself." She flashed round upon him almost angrily. "Why do you utter these set speeches to me?" she demanded. And then, before he could recover from his astonishment to make any answer, she had resumed a normal manner and was talking quickly. She told him of Una's premonitions about Dick. Told him, in short, what it was that Una desired to talk to him about. "You bade her come to me?" he said. "Of course, after your promise to me." He was silent and very thoughtful for a moment. "I wonder that Una needed to be told that she had in me a friend," he said slowly. "I wonder to whom she would have gone on her own impulse." "To Count Sam Oval," Miss Armitage informed him. "Sam Oval," he rapped the name out sharply. He was clearly angry. "That man! I can't understand why Omoe should suffer him about the house so much. Terence, like everybody else, will suffer anything that Una wishes. Then Terence is more of a fool than I ever suspected." There was a brief pause. "If you were to fail Una in this," said Miss Armitage presently, "I mean that unless you yourself give her the assurance that you are ready to do what you can for Dick, should the occasion arise, I am afraid that in her present foolish mood she may still avail herself of Count Samoval. That would be to give Samoval a hold upon her, and I tremble to think what the consequences might be. That man is a snake, a horror." The frankness with which he spoke was to Tremaine full evidence of her anxiety. He was prompt to allay it. "She shall have that assurance this very evening," he promised. "I at least have not pledged my word to anything or to anyone. Even so," he added slowly, "the chances of my services being ever required grow more slender every day. Una may be full of premonitions about Dick, but between premonition and event there is something of a gap." Again a pause, and then, "I am glad," said Miss Armitage, "to think that Una has a friend, a trustworthy friend, upon whom she can depend. She is so incapable of depending upon herself. All her life there has been someone at hand to guide her and screen her from unpleasantness, until she's remained just a sweet, dear child to be taken by the hand in every dark lane of life. But she has you, Miss Armitage." "Me?" Miss Armitage spoke deprecatingly. "I don't think I am a very able or experienced guide. Besides, even such as I am, she may not have me very long now. I had letters from home this morning. Father is not very well, and Mother writes that he misses me. I am thinking of returning soon. But you have only just come." She brightened and laughed at the dismay in his voice. "Indeed, I have been here 6 weeks." She looked out over the shimmering moonlit waters of the Tagus and the shadowy, ghostly ships of the British fleet that rode at anchor there, and her eyes were wistful. Her fingers, with that little gesture peculiar to her in moments of constraint, were again entwining themselves in her rope of pearls. "Yes," she said almost musingly, "I think I must be going soon." He was dismayed. He realized that the moment for action had come. His heart was sounding the charge within him, And then that cursed rope of pearls, emblem of the wealth and luxury in which he had been nurtured, stood like an impassable abatis across his path. You will be glad to go, of course, he suggested. Hardly that. It has been very pleasant here. She sighed. We shall miss you very much, he said gloomily. The house at Monsanto will not be the same when you are gone. Una will be lost and desolate without you. It occurs to me sometimes, she said slowly, that the people about Una think too much of Una and too little of themselves. It was a cryptic speech. In another, it might have signified a spitefulness unthinkable in Sylvia Armitage. Therefore, it puzzled him very deeply. He stood silent, wondering what precisely she might mean, and thus in silence they continued for a spell. Then slowly she turned, and the blaze of light from the windows fell about her irradiantly. She was rather pale, and her eyes were of a suspiciously excessive brightness. And again she made use of the phrase, Una will be waiting for you. Yet as before he stood silent and immovable, considering her, questioning himself, searching her face and his own soul. All he saw was that rope of shimmering pearls. And after all, as yourself suggested, it is possible that others may be waiting for me, she added presently. Instantly he was crestfallen and contrite. I sincerely beg your pardon, Miss Armitage. And with a pang of which his imperturbable exterior gave no hint, he proffered her his arm. She took it, barely touching it with her fingertips, and they re-entered the anteroom. When do you think that you will be leaving? He asked her gently. There was a note of harshness in the voice that answered him. I don't know yet, but very soon. The sooner the better, I think. And then the sleek and courtly Samoval, detaching from, seeming to materialize out of, the glittering throng they had entered, was bowing low before her, claiming her attention, knowing her feelings. Tremaine would not have relinquished her, but to his infinite amazement she herself slipped her fingers from his scarlet sleeve to place them upon the black one that Samoval was gracefully proffering, and greeted Samoval with a gay raillery as oddly in contrast with her grave demeanor towards the captain as with her recent avowal of detestation for the Count. Stricken and half angry, Tremaine stood looking after them as they receded towards the ballroom. To increase his chagrin came a laugh from Miss Armitage, sharp and rather strident, floating towards him, and Miss Armitage's laugh was wont to be low and restrained. Samoval, no doubt, had resources to amuse a woman, even a woman who instinctively disliked him, resources of which Captain Tremaine himself knew nothing. And then someone tapped him on the shoulder. A very tall, hawk-faced man in a scarlet coat and tightly strapped blue trousers stood beside him. It was Calhoun Grant, the ablest intelligence officer in Wellington's service. Why, Colonel, cried Tremaine, holding out his hand. I didn't know you were in Lisbon. I arrived only this afternoon. The keen eyes flashed after the disappearing figures of Sylvia and her cavalier. Tell me, what is the name of the irresistible gallant who has so lightly ravished you of your quite delicious companion? Count Samoval, said Tremaine shortly. Grant's face remained inscrutable. Really, he said softly. So that is Geronimo de Samoval, eh? How very interesting. A great supporter of the British policy. Therefore an altruist, since himself he is a sufferer by it, and I hear that he has become a great friend of Omoes. He is at Monsanto a good deal, certainly, Tremaine admitted. Most interesting. Grant was slowly nodding, and a faint smile curled his thin, sensitive lips. But I'm keeping you, Tremaine, and no doubt you will be dancing. I shall perhaps see you tomorrow. I shall be coming up to Monsanto. And with a wave of the hand, he passed on and was gone. Chapter 7. The Ally. Tremaine elbowed his way through the gorgeous crowd, exchanging greetings here and there as he went, and so reached the ballroom during a pause in the dancing. He looked round for Lady Omoe, but he could see her nowhere, and would never have found her had not Carruthers pointed out a knot of officers and assured him that the lady was in the heart of it and in imminent peril of being suffocated. Thither the captain bent his steps, looking neither to right nor left in his singleness of purpose. Thus it happened that he saw neither Omoe, who had just arrived, nor the massive, decorated bulk of Marshal Beresford, with whom the adjutant stood in conversation on the skirts of throng that so assiduously worshipped at her ladyship's shrine. Captain Tremaine went through the group with all a sapper's skill at piercing obstacles, and so came face to face with the lady of his quest. Seeing her so radiant now, with sparkling eyes and ready laugh, It was difficult to conceive her haunted by any such anxieties as Miss Armitage had mentioned. Yet the moment she perceived him, as if his presence acted as a reminder to lift her out of the delicious present, something of her gaiety underwent eclipse. Child of impulse that she was, she gave no thought to her action and the construction it might possibly bear in the minds of men chagrined and slighted. "Why, Ned," she cried, "you have kept me waiting," and with a complete and charming ignoring of the claims of all who had been before him and who were warring there for precedence of one another, she took his arm in token that she yielded herself to him before even the honor was so much as solicited. With nods and smiles to right and left, a queen dismissing her court, she passed on the captain's arm to the little crowd that gave way before her dismayed and intrigued, and so away. Omoe, who had been awaiting a favorable moment to present the marshal by the marshal's own request, attempted to thrust forward now with Beresford at his side. But the bowing line of officers whose backs were towards him effectively barred his progress, and before they had broken up that formation, her ladyship and her cavalier were out of sight, lost in the moving crowd. The marshal laughed good-humoredly. "The infallible reward of patience," said he, and Omoe laughed with him. But the next moment he was scowling at what he overheard. "On my soul, that was impudence," an Irish infantryman had protested. "Have you ever heard," quoth a heavy dragoon, who was also a heavy jester, "that in heaven the last shall be first? If you pay court to an angel, you must submit to celestial customs." "And bedad," rejoined the infantryman, "as there's no Maury in heaven, you got to make the best of it with other men's wives. Sure, it's a great success that fellow should be in paradise. Did you remark the way she melted to him beauty, swooning at the sight of temptation? Bad luck to him. Who is he at all?" They dispersed laughing and followed by Omoe's scowling eyes. It annoyed him that his wife's thoughtless conduct should render her the butt of such jests as these, and perhaps a subject for lewd gossip. He would speak to her about it later. Meanwhile, the marshal had linked arms with him. "Since the privilege must be postponed," said he, "suppose that we seek supper. I have always found that a man can best heal in his stomach the wounds taken by the heart." His fleshy bulk afforded a certain prima facie confirmation of the dictum. With a roll more suggestive of the quarter-deck than the saddle, the great man bore off Omoe in quest of material consolation. Yet, as they went, the adjutant's eyes raked the ballroom in quest of his wife. That quest, however, was unsuccessful, for his wife was already in the garden. "I want to talk to you most urgently, Ned. Take me somewhere where we can be quite private," she had begged the captain. "Somewhere where there is no danger of being overheard." Her agitation, now uncontrolled, suggested to Tremaine that the matter might be far more serious and urgent than Miss Armitage had represented it. He thought first of the balcony where he had lately been, but then the balcony opened immediately from the anteroom and was likely at any moment to be invaded. So, since the night was soft and warm, he preferred the garden. Her ladyship went to find a wrap. Then arm in arm they passed out and were lost in the shadows of an avenue of palm trees. "It is about Dick," she said breathlessly. "I know, Miss Armitage told me." "What did she tell you?" "That you had a premonition that he might come to you for assistance." "A premonition?" Her ladyship laughed nervously. "It is more than a premonition, Ned. He has come." The captain stopped in his stride and stood quite still. "Come," he echoed. "Dick?" "S.H.," she warned him, and sang her voice from very instinct. "He came to me this evening, half an hour before we left home. I have put him in an alcove adjacent to my dressing room for the present." "You have left him there?" He was alarmed. "Oh, there's no fear. No one ever goes there except Bridget. And I have locked the alcove. He's fast asleep. He was asleep before I left. The poor fellow was so worn and weary." Followed details of his appearance and a recital of his wanderings, so far as he had made them known to her. And he was so insistent that no one should know, not even Terence. "Terence must not know," he said gravely. "You think that too? If Terence knows, well, you will regret it all the days of your life, Una." He was so stern, so impressive, that she begged for explanation. He afforded it. "You would be doing Terence the utmost cruelty if you told him. You would be compelling him to choose between his honor and his concern for you. And since he is the very soul of honor, he must sacrifice you and himself, your happiness and his own, everything that makes life good for you both, to his duty." She was aghast, for all that she was far from understanding. But he went on relentlessly to make his meaning clear, for the sake of Omoe as much as for her own, for the sake of the future of these two people who were perhaps his dearest friends. He saw in what danger shipwrecked their happiness now stood, and he took the determination of clearly pointing out to her every shoal in the water through which she must steer her course. Since this has happened, Una, you must be told the whole truth. You must listen, and above all, be reasonable. I am Dick's friend, as I am your own and Terence's. Your father was my best friend, perhaps, and my gratitude to him is unbounded, as I hope you know. You and Dick are almost as brother and sister to me. In spite of this, indeed because of this, I have prayed for news that Dick was dead. Her grasp interrupted him, and he felt the tightening clutch of her hands upon his arm in the gloom. I have prayed this for Dick's sake, and more than all for the sake of your happiness and Terence's. If Dick has taken the choice before Terence is a tragic one. You will realize it when I tell you that duty forced him to pledge his word to the Portuguese government that Dick should be shot when found. Oh! It was a gasp of horror, of incredulity. She loosed his arm and drew away from him. It is infamous. I can't believe it. I can't. It is true. I swear it to you. I was present and I heard. And you allowed it? What could I do? How could I interfere? Besides, the minister who demanded that undertaking knew nothing of the relationship between Omoe and this missing officer. But he could have been told. That would have made no difference, unless it were to create fresh difficulties. She stood there ghostly white against the gloom. A dry sob broke from her. Terence did that. Terence did that, she moaned. And then in a surge of anger, I shall never speak to Terence again. I shall not live with him another day. It was infamous. Infamous. It was not infamous. It was almost noble, almost heroic. He amazed her. Listen, Una, and try to understand. He took her arm again and drew her gently on down the avenue of moonlight-fretted darkness. Oh, I understand, she cried bitterly. I understand perfectly. He has always been hard on Dick. He has always made mountains out of molehills where Dick was concerned. He forgets that Dick is young, a mere boy. He judges Dick from the standpoint of his own sober middle age. Why, he's an old man, a wicked old man. Thus her rage, hurling at Omoe when the insolence of her youth seemed the last insult. You are very unjust, Una. You are even a little stupid, he said, deeming the punishment necessary and salutary. Stupid. Stupid. I have never been called stupid before. But you have undoubtedly deserved to be, he assured her with perfect calm. It took her aback by its directness, and for a moment left her without an answer. Then, I think you had better leave me, she told him frostily. You forget yourself. Perhaps I do, he admitted. That is because I am more concerned to think of Dick and Terence and yourself. Sit down, Una. They had reached a little circle by a piece of ornamental water, facing which a granite-hewn seat had been placed. She sank to it obediently, if sulkily. It may perhaps help you to understand what Terence has done when I tell you that in his place, loving Dick as I do, I must have pledged myself precisely as he did, or else despise myself forever. And being pledged, I must keep my word or go in the same self-contempt. He elaborated his argument by explaining the full circumstances under which the pledge had been exacted. But be in no doubt about it, he concluded. If Terence knows of Dick's presence at Monsanto, he has no choice. He must deliver him up to a firing party, or to a court-martial which will inevitably sentence him to death, no matter what the defense that Dick may urge. He is a man prejudged, foredoomed by the necessities of war. And Terence will do this, although it will break his heart and ruin all his life. Understand me, then, that in enjoining you never to allow Terence to suspect that Dick is present, I am pleading not so much for you or for Dick, but for Terence himself. For it is upon Terence that the hardest and most tragic suffering must fall. Now do you understand? I understand that men are very stupid, was her way of admitting it. And you see that you were wrong in judging Terence as you did? I suppose so. She didn't understand it all. But since Tremaine was so insistent, she supposed there must be something in his point of view. She had been brought up in the belief that Ned Tremaine was common sense incarnate, and although she often doubted it, as you may doubt the dogmas of religion in which you've been bred, Yet she never openly rebelled against that inculcated faith. Above all, she wanted to cry. She knew that it would be very good for her. She had often found a singular relief in tears when vexed by things beyond her understanding. But she had to think of that flock of gallants in the ballroom waiting to pay court to her, and of her duty towards them of preserving her beauty unimpaired by the ravages of a vented sorrow. Tremaine sat down beside her. So now that we understand each other on that score, let us consider ways and means to dispose of Dick. At once she was uplifted and became all eagerness. Yes, you will help me, Ned. You can depend upon me to do all in human power. He thought rapidly and gave voice to some of his thoughts. If I could, I would take him to my lodgings at Alconara. But Carruthers knows him and would see him there. So that is out of question. Then again, it is dangerous to move him about. At any moment, he might be seen and recognized. Hardly recognized, she said. His beard disguises him, and his dress. She shuddered at the very thought of the figure he had cut. He, the jaunty, dandy Richard Butler. That is something, of course, he agreed, and then asked, how long do you think that you could keep him hidden? I don't know. You see, there's Bridget. She is the only danger, as she is charge of my dressing room. It may be desperate, but can you trust her? Oh, I am sure I can. She is devoted to me. She would do anything. She must be bought as well. Devotion and gain, when linked together, will form an unbreakable bond. Don't let us be stingy. Una, take her into your confidence boldly, and promise her 100 guineas for her silence, payable on the day that Dick leaves the country. But how are we to get him out of the country? I think I know a way. I can depend on Marcus Glennie. I may tell him the whole truth and the identity of our man, or I may not. I must think about that. But whatever I decide, I am sure I can induce Glennie to take our fugitive home in the Telemachus and land him safely somewhere in Ireland, where he will have to lose himself for a while. Perhaps for Glennie's sake, it will be safer not to disclose Dick's identity. Then if there should be trouble later, Glennie, having known nothing of the real facts, will not be held responsible. I will talk to him tonight. Do you think he will consent? She asked in strained anxiety. Anxiety to have her anxieties dispelled. I am sure he will. I can almost pledge my word on it. Marcus would do anything to serve me. Oh! Set your mind at rest. Consider the thing done. Keep Dick safely hidden for a week or so until the Telemachus is ready to sail. He mustn't go on board until the last moment, for several reasons, and I will see to the rest. Under that confident promise, her troubles fell from her as lightly as they ever did. You are very good to me, Ned. Forgive me what I said just now, and I think I understand about Terence. Poor dear old Terence. Of course you do. Moved to comfort her, as he might have been moved to comfort a child. He flung his arm along the seat behind her and patted her shoulder soothingly. I knew you would understand. And not a word to Terence. Not a word that could so much as awaken his suspicions. Remember that. Oh, I shall. Fell a step upon the patch behind them, crunching the gravel. Captain Tremaine, his arm still along the back of the seat, and seeming to envelop her ladyship, looked over her shoulder. A tall figure was advancing briskly. He recognized it even in the gloom by its height and gait and swing for Omoes. Why, here is Terence, he said easily. So easily, with such frank and obvious honesty of welcome, that the anger in which Omoe came wrapped fell from him on the instant, to be replaced by shame. I have been looking for you everywhere, my dear, he said to Una. Marshal Beresford is anxious to pay you his respects before he leaves, and you have been so hedged about by gallants all the evening that it's devil a chance he's had of approaching you. There was a certain constraint in his voice, for a man may not recover instantly from such feelings as those which had fetched him hot-foot down that path at sight of those two figures sitting so close and intimate, the young man's arm so proprietorially about the lady's shoulders, as it seemed. Lady Omoe sprang up at once, with a little silvery laugh that was singularly carefree, for had not Tremaine lifted the burden entirely from her shoulders? You should have married a Dowd, she mocked him. Then you have found her more easily accessible. Instead of finding her dallying in the moonlight with my secretary, he rallied back between good and ill humor, and he turned to Tremaine. Damned indiscreet of you, Ned, he added more severely. Suppose you've been seen by any of the scandal-mongering old wives of the garrison? A nice thing for Una and a nice thing for me, begad, to be made the subject of fly-blown talk over the teacups. Tremaine accepted the rebuke in the friendly spirit in which it appeared to be conveyed. Sorry, Omoi, he said. You're quite right. We should have thought of it. Everybody isn't to know what our relations are. And again he was so manifestly honest and so completely at his ease that it was impossible to harbor any thought of evil, and Omoi felt again a glow of shame and suspicion so utterly unworthy and dishonoring. Chapter 8. The Intelligence Officer. In a small room of Count Redondo's palace, a room that had been set apart for cards, sat 3 men about a card table. They were Count Samoval, the elderly Marquis of Minas, lean, bald, and vulturine of aspect, with a deep set-eye that glared fiercely through a single eyeglass rimmed in tortoiseshell, and a gentleman still on the fair side of middle age, with a clear-cut face and iron gray hair, who wore the dark green uniform of a major cacadores. Considering his Portuguese uniform, it is odd that the low-toned, earnest conversation amongst them should have been conducted in French. There were cards on the table, but there was no pretense of play. You might conceive them a group of players who, wearied of their game, had relinquished it for conversation. They were the only tenants of the room, which was small, cedar-paneled, and lighted by a girandole of sparkling crystal. Through the closed door came faintly from the distant ballroom the strains of the dance music. With perhaps the single exception of the Principal Sousa, the British policy had no more bitter opponent in Portugal than the Marquis of Minas, once a member of the Council of Regency, before Sousa had been elected to that body. He had quitted it in disgust at the British measures. His chief ground of umbrage had been the appointment of British officers to the command of the Portuguese regiments, which formed the division under Marshal Beresford. In this he saw a deliberate insult and slight to his country and his countrymen. He was a man of burning and blinded patriotism, to whom Portugal was the most glorious nation in the world. He lived in his country's splendid past, refusing to recognize that the days of Henry the Navigator, of Vasco da Gama, of Manuel the Fortunate, days in which Portugal had been great, indeed among the nations of the Old World, were gone and done with. He respected Britons as great merchants and industrious traders. But after all, merchants and traders are not the peers of fighters on land and sea, of navigators, conquerors, and civilizers, such as his countrymen had been, such as he believed them still to be. That the descendants of Gamas, Cunhas, Magales, and Albuquerques, men whose names were indelibly written upon the very face of the world, should be passed over, whilst alien officers leave been brought in a train and command the Portuguese legions, was an affront to Portugal which Minas could never forgive. It was thus that he had become a rebel, withdrawing from a government whose supineness he could not condone. For a while his rebellion had been passive, until the Principal Sousa had heated him in the fire of his own rage and fashioned him into an intriguing instrument of the first power. He was listening intently now to the soft, rapid speech of the gentleman in the major's uniform. Of course, rumors had reached the prince of this policy of devastation, he was saying, but His Highness has been disposed to treat these rumors lightly, unable to see, as indeed are we all, what useful purpose such a policy could finally serve. He does not underrate the talents of my Lord Wellington as a commander. He does not imagine that he will pursue such operations out of pure wantonness. Yet if such operations are indeed being pursued, what can they be but wanton? A moment, Count. He stayed Samoval, who was about to interrupt. His mind and manner were authoritative. We know most positively from the Emperor's London agents that the war is unpopular in England. We know that public opinion is being prepared for a British retreat, for the driving of the British into the sea, as must inevitably happen once Monsieur Le Prince decides to launch his boat. Here in the Tagus the British fleet lies ready to embark the troops, and the British cabinet itself, he spoke more slowly and emphatically, expects an embarkation to take place at latest in September, which is just about the time that the French offensive should be at its height and the French troops under the very walls of Lisbon. I admit that by this policy of devastation, if indeed it be true, added to the stubborn contesting of every foot of ground, the French advance may be retarded, but the process will be costly to Britain in lives and money, and more costly still to Portugal, croaked the Marquis of Minas, and, as you say, Monsieur le Marquis, more costly still to Portugal. Let me for a moment show you another side of the picture. The French administration, so sane, so cherishing, animated purely by ideas of progress, enforcing wise and beneficial laws, making the effort for prosperity and well-being of conquered nations, knows how to render itself popular wherever it is established. This Portugal knows already, or at least some part of it. There was the administration of Sultan Oporto, so entirely satisfactory to the people that it was no inconsiderable party was prepared, subject to the emperor's consent, to offer him the crown and settle down peacefully under his rule. There was the administration of Junot in Lisbon. I ask you, when was Lisbon better governed? Contrast for a moment with these the present British administration, for it amounts to an administration. Consider the burning grievances that must be left behind by this policy of laying the country waste, of pauperising 1 million people of all degrees, driving them homeless from the lands on which they were born, after compelling them to lend a hand in the destruction of all that their labor has built up through long years. If any policy could better serve the purposes of France, I know it not. The people from here to Beira should be ready to receive the French with open arms, and to welcome their deliverance from this most costly and bitter British protection. Do you, messrs, detect a flaw in these arguments? Both shook their heads. Bien, said the major of Portuguese cacadores. Then we reach one or two only possible conclusions. Either these rumors of policy of devastation, which have reached the Prince of Esslingen, are as utterly false as he believes them to be, or, to my cost, I know them to be true, as I have already told you, Samoval interrupted bitterly. Or, the major persisted, raising a hand to restrain the count. Or there is something further that has not been yet discovered, a mystery the enucleation of which will shed light upon all the rest. Since you assure me, Monsieur le Comte, that my Lord Wellington's policy is beyond doubt, as reported to Monsieur le Maréchal, it but remains to address ourselves to the discovery of the mystery underlying it. What conclusions have you reached? You, Monsieur de Samoval, have had exceptional opportunities of observation, I understand. I am afraid my opportunities have been none so exceptional as you suppose, replied Samoval, with a dubious shake of his sleek, dark head. At one time, I founded great hopes in Lady Omoe, but Lady Omoe is a fool and does not enjoy her husband's confidence in official matters. What she knows, I know. Unfortunately, it does not amount to very much. One conclusion, however, I have reached. Wellington is preparing in Portugal a snare for Massena's army. A snare? The major pursed his full lips into a smile of scorn. There cannot be a trap with two exits, my friend. Massena enters Portugal at Almeida and marches to Lisbon and the open sea. He may be inconvenienced or hampered in his march, but its goal is certain, where then can lie the snare. Your theory presupposes an impassable barrier to arrest the French when they are deep in the country, and an overwhelming force to cut off their retreat when that barrier is reached. The overwhelming force does not exist and cannot be manufactured. As for the barrier, no barrier that it lies within human power to construct lies beyond French power to overstride. I should not make too sure of that, Samoval warned him, and you have overlooked something. The major glanced at the Count sharply and without satisfaction. He accounted himself, trained as even under the very eye of the great emperor, of some force in strategy and tactics, a player too well versed in the game to overlook the possible moves of an opponent. Ha! He said with the ghost of a sneer. For instance, Monsieur le Comte? The overwhelming force exists, said Samoval. Where is it then? Whence has it been created? If you refer to the united British and Portuguese troops, you will be good enough to bear in mind that they will be retreating before the prince. They cannot at once be before and behind him. The man's cool assurance and cooler contempt of Samoval's views stung the Count into some sharpness. Are you seeking information, sir, or are you bestowing it? He inquired. Your pardon, Monsieur le Comte. I inquire, of course. I put forward arguments to anticipate conditions that may possibly be erroneous. Samoval waved the point. There is another force besides the British and Portuguese troops that you have left out of your calculations, and that... The major was still faintly incredulous. You should remember what Wellington obviously remembers, that a French army depends for its sustenance upon the country it is invading. That is why Wellington is stripping the French line of penetration as bare of sustenance as this card table. If we assume the existence of the barrier, an impassable line of fortifications encountered within many marches of the frontier, we may also assume that starvation will be the overwhelming force that will cut off the French retreat. The other's keen eyes flickered. For a moment his face lost its assurance, and it was Samoval's turn to smile. But the Major made a sharp recovery. He slowly shook his iron-gray head. You have no right to assume an impassable barrier. That is an inadmissible hypothesis. There is no such thing as a line of fortifications impassable to the French. You will pardon me, Major, but it is yourself have no right to your own assumptions. Again, you overlook something. I will grant that technically what you say is true. No fortifications can be built that cannot be destroyed, given adequate power, with which it is yet to prove that Messina, not knowing what may await him, will be equipped. But let us for a moment take so much for granted, and now consider this. Fortifications are unquestionably building in the region of Torres Vedras, and Wellington guards a secret so jealously that not even the British, either here or in England, are aware of their nature. That is why the cabinet in London takes for granted an embarkation in September. Wellington has not even taken his government into his confidence. That is the sort of man he is. Now, these fortifications have been building since last October. Best part of 8 months have already gone in their construction. It may be another 2 or 3 months before the French army reaches them. I do not say that the French cannot pass them, given time. But how long will it take the French to pull down what it will have taken 10 or 11 months to construct? And if they are unable to draw sustenance from a desolate, wasted country, what time will they have at their disposal? It will be with them a matter of life or death. Having come so far, they must reach Lisbon or perish. And if the fortifications could delay them by a single month, then, granted that all Lord Wellington's other dispositions have been duly carried out, perish they must. It remains, Monsieur le Major, for you to determine whether, with all their energy, with all their genius and all their valor, the French can, in an ill-nourished condition, destroy in a few weeks the considered labor of nearly a year. The Major was aghast. He had changed color, and through his eyes, wide and staring, his stupefaction glared forth at them. Minas uttered a dry cough under cover of his hand, and screwed up his eyeglass to regard the Major more attentively. You do not appear to have considered all that, he said. But, my dear Marquis, was a half-indignant answer. Why was I not told all this to begin with? You represented yourself as but indifferently informed, Monsieur de Samoval. Whereas, so I am, my dear Major, as far as information goes. If I did not use these arguments before, it was because it seemed to me an impertinence to offer what, after all, are no more than conclusions of my own constructive and deductive reasoning to one so well versed in strategy as yourself. The Major was silenced for a moment. I congratulate you, Count, he said. Monsieur le Maréchal shall have your views without delay. Tell me, he begged, you say these fortifications lie in the region of Torres Vedras. Can you be more precise? I think so. But again I warn you that I can tell you only what I infer. I judge they will run from the sea, somewhere near the mouth of the Zizandra, in a semicircle to the Tagus, somewhere to the south of Santarem. I know that they do not reach as far north as San, because the roads are open, whereas all roads to the south, where I am assuming that the fortifications lie, are closed and closely guarded. Why do you suggest a semicircle? Because that is the formation of the hills, and presumably the line of heights will be followed. Yes, the Major approved slowly. And the distance, then, would be some 30 or 40 miles? Fully. The Major's face relaxed its gravity. He even smiled. You will agree, Count, that in a line of that extent a uniform strength is out of the question. It must perforce present many weak, many vulnerable places. Oh, undoubtedly. Plans of these lines must be in existence. Again, undoubtedly. Sir Terence O'Moy will have plans in his possession showing their projected extent. Colonel Fletcher, who is in charge of construction, is in constant communication with the adjutant, himself an engineer, and, as I partly imagine, partly infer from odd phrases that I have overheard, especially entrusted by Lord Wellington with the supervision of the works. 2 things, then, are necessary, said the Major promptly. The first is that the devastation of the country should be retarded, and as far as possible hindered altogether. That, said Minas, you may safely leave to myself and Sousa's other friends, the northern noblemen who have no intention of becoming the victims of British disinclination to pitch battles. The second, and this is more difficult, is that we should obtain by hook or by crook a plan of the fortifications. And he looked directly at Samoval. The Count nodded slowly, but his face expressed doubt. I am quite alive to the necessity. I always have been. But to a man of your resource and intelligence, an intelligence which you had just given such very signal proof, the matter should be possible. He paused a moment. Then, if I understand you correctly, Monsieur de Saint-Mauval, your fortunes have suffered deeply, and you are almost ruined by this policy of Wellington's. You are offered the opportunity of making a magnificent recovery. The Emperor is the most generous paymaster in the world, and he is beyond measure impatient at the manner in which the campaign in the peninsula is dragging on. He has spoken of it as an ulcer that is draining the empire of its resources. For the man who could render him the service of disclosing the weak spot in this armor, the Achilles heel of the British, there will be a reward beyond all your possible dreams. Obtain the plans, then, and... He checked abruptly. The door had opened, and in a Venetian mirror facing him upon the wall, the Major caught the reflection of a British uniform, the stiff gold collar surmounted by a bronze hawk face with which he was acquainted. I beg your pardon, gentlemen, said the officer in Portuguese. I was looking for... His voice became indistinct, so that they never knew who it was that he had been seeking when he intruded upon their privacy. The door had closed again, and the reflection had vanished from the mirror, but there were beads of perspiration on the Major's brow. It is fortunate, he muttered breathlessly, that my back was towards him. I would as soon meet the devil face to face. I didn't dream he was in Lisbon. Who is he? Asked Minas. Colonel Grant, the British intelligence officer. Phew, name of a name. Wouldn't escape. The Major mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief. Beware of him, Monsieur de Saint-Mauval. He rose. He was obviously shaken by the meeting. If one of you will kindly make quite sure that he is not about, I think that I had better go. If we should meet, everything might be ruined. Then, with a change of manner, he stayed Saint-Mauval, who was already on his way to the door. We understand each other, then? He questioned them. I have my papers, and at dawn I leave Lisbon. I shall report your conclusions to the prince, and in anticipation, I may already offer you the expression of his profoundest gratitude. Meanwhile, you know what is to do. Opposition to the policy and the plans of the fortifications. Above all the plans. He shook hands with them, and having waited until Saint-Mauval assured him that the corridor outside was clear, he took his departure and was soon afterwards driving home, congratulating himself upon his most fortunate escape from the hawk eye of Calhoun Grant. But when in the dead of that night, he was awakened to find a British sergeant with a halberd and 6 redcoats with fixed bayonets surrounding his bed, it occurred to him belatedly that what one man can see in a mirror is also visible to another, and that Marshal Messina, Prince of Esslingen, waiting for information beyond Ciudad Rodrigo, would never enjoy the advantages of a report of Count Samoval's massively constructive and deductive reasoning.